Welcome. Tonight, we'll journey to a place both dazzling and demanding, a place where beauty and pressure walked hand in hand. A place where the smell of fresh plaster mingled with the sharp scent of linseed oil, and the quiet echo of chisels on marble filled the stone corridors long before tourists ever arrived. We're traveling to Florence, Italy. Not the Florence of modern postcards or dreamy getaways, but the Florence of the 15th century, right in the thick of the Renaissance. This was a time when the city was practically bursting with genius. Painters, sculptors, mathematicians, architects, all pushing human potential to new heights. But behind every celebrated masterpiece was a room full of aching backs, splattered aprons, and apprentices who hadn't seen the sun in days. Tonight, we'll wander through that world, not through the eyes of a famous artist, but through yours. Imagine, just for a while, that you have arrived in Florence not as a visitor, but as an apprentice. A nobody. One of the many young workers trying to earn your name, your skill, and your next meal in a workshop that smelled faintly of sweat and sawdust. We'll explore what it was like to live and work in this breathtakingly difficult world. The pressure, the rivalry, the humiliations, and yes, a little dinner with the Medici, because why not end the night with a little rich people awkwardness? So, lie back. Let your thoughts settle like old pigment at the bottom of a clay jar. As your breath slows, we'll begin, not with a masterpiece, but with the grinding start of every artistic career in Florence, the thankless labor of the workshop apprentice. Chapter 1. The Apprentice's Burden. Imagine it's still dark out when you rise. The kind of quiet dark where the only sound is the rustle of your coarse linen tunic against straw bedding and the far-off clatter of a horse cart on the stone streets. You're barely 13, maybe 15, if your village lied about your age to get you out of the house. You've been handed off to a master painter in Florence, and your name went to be remembered not unless you somehow become the next Giotto or accidentally spill paint on a Medici's robe. The workshop you stumble into is not glamorous. There's no golden light streaming through cathedral windows. It's cold. It smells like wet wood, old wine, and something vaguely burnt that might be glue. You are handed a lump of lapis lazuli, the beautiful blue stone they say came from the east, and a hammer. Your job for the day? Crush it into powder. Carefully, slowly, endlessly. And you thought art school was expensive now. Your hands are already cracked from the lime wash you scrubbed the walls with yesterday. And the faint blue dust starts to cling to your skin, staining it like a noble curse. The master barely looks at you. His assistants bustle around, mixing binders, heating wax, laying out eggs. Yes, eggs. Because tempera painting wasn't done with oils back then. Not yet. Each yolk has to be separated just right. And heaven help you if you get a single speck of shell in the mix. You aren't allowed to touch a brush. Not yet, not for years, probably. First, you must prove you can copy. That you can grind the colors right. That you can stay quiet and invisible while men twice your size argue over whether an angel should be looking to the left or to the heavens. At night, your arms throb from mixing pigments with mortar. And pestles, and you smell like rabbit skin glue. Because, yes, even the canvas had to be prepared from scratch. You are quite literally elbow deep in every step before art even begins. And there's no complaining. Not unless you want to be sent back home. Or worse, replaced by someone younger, stronger, or cheaper. Your only reward is the occasional glimpse of the master's current piece. A vast wooden panel covered in chalk drawings, the faint outline of a saint beginning to take shape. You stare at it, half in awe, half in envy. Will you ever get to do that? Will your lines ever be part of something this grand? Sometimes late at night, the master does let you help. Not with painting, of course, but with transferring his drawings. You are handed a bag of charcoal dust and a prickly needle. You place parchment over the sketch, prick tiny holes along every contour, then tap the charcoal over it to leave a ghostly trace on the final surface. It's called spolvero. Sounds romantic, right? It's not. It is backbreaking and nerve-wracking and the quickest way to ruin an entire week's work if you sneeze at the wrong time. And the master? He never thanks you. At best, he doesn't yell. Meanwhile, food is basic. If you're lucky, there's stale bread soaked in wine or broth. If you're really lucky, a bit of goat cheese. Often, the older apprentices steal the better scraps. No one says anything. It's a quiet hierarchy built on exhaustion and bruised egos. Still, there's something about the rhythm. The daily grind literally becomes her. The scent of linseed oil, the glow of pigment jars in the morning light, the sound of brushes softly scratching wood. It's a world apart from farms and fields. It may not be kind, but it is beautiful. And in some quiet corner of your mind, you think, maybe, just maybe, if you survive this, your name might one day be whispered in these same halls. But first, you have to make it through another day without spilling the vermilion. Evening brings no real rest. After the day's work, apprentices sleep in the loft above the studio or in a cold annex behind the courtyard. No mattress, just straw. You curl up still faintly covered in powdered ochre and traces of egg yolk dried stiff on your cuffs. The scent of the workshop clings to you smoke from the heating pots, the wax and the faint tongue of vinegar used in cleaning brushes. There are no lullabies here, no quiet evenings by the hearth. Just the constant creak of wood beams above your head, and the snores of other boys packed in the dark like brushes in a painter's box. You dream, if you're lucky, of someday being allowed to sign a piece. Just one. Not even the whole painting. Just a small monogram in a corner. The sad truth is, most apprentices never do. Some become assistants, some drift into other trades, and some give up entirely. The ones who stay must fight for every inch of respect. And even when you do start painting, your strokes must match the master's perfectly, not better, never better. The master's hand must be seen. Your job is to disappear into it. In those early years, most of your art training isn't glamorous or even particularly artistic. You learn geometry so you can design perfect halos. You study the human form by copying from live models or anatomical sketches, many of which are borderline illegal depending on who's watching. You learn how to paint folds into cloth and how to layer colors in precise sequences so that saints appear to glow under candlelight. But you also learn how to navigate egos, how to dodge thrown brushes during outbursts, and how to pretend you didn't hear when the master cursed the patron under his breath. Sometimes you're sent to buy materials from apothecaries or fabric merchants, wandering through the tightly packed alleyways of Florence with a list in hand, desperately hoping you don't mess it up. One wrong pigment, one mislabeled jar, and you're done. Worse, you're often treated as if you're invisible or worse, like a servant. Some shopkeepers will try to short you and you're expected to know better. Not because you've been taught, but because you're supposed to pick it up along the way. No instructions, just observations. You are, after all, being trained in more than art. You're being molded into a future master. At least that's what they say. What they don't say out loud is this: you're also cheap labor. The kind that doesn't question orders, doesn't ask about wages, and doesn't complain when your knees ache from floor scrubbing or your shoulders burn from holding panels upright for hours while someone else paints. You are an extension of the workshop, not a person, at least not yet. One of the crueler ironies is that while you do all the grunt work, the finished paintings are praised as divine. Patrons gaze at the final product in candlelit chapels and exclaim how the artist captured heaven itself. They'll never know that the clouds were tinted by your ground lead white, that the sky's softness came from your perfectly egg-tempered ultramarine, and that every gold leaf was applied with breath you held for fear of sneezing. They'll never say your name in gratitude. In fact, they'll never say your name at all. Even on feast days when some workshops take a break and the streets of Florence fill with pageants, music and parades, you are often stuck behind, because guess who has to help repaint the wooden saints carried on floats? Guess who has to touch up the backdrops and men-torn canvas? The art must shine. Even if you don't, and when the master hosts a patron, some minor nobleman or wealthy merchant looking for a portrait or devotional scene, you reorder to stand still and silent. You observe how the master flatters the client, speaks of divine inspiration, never once mentioning the literal sweat dripping from your brow in the back room as you prepared the base. There are moments of wonder, though. Times when a new commission arrives and the whole studio buzzes with possibility. A large altarpiece, perhaps, or a fresco cycle for a chapel. The talk turns to composition, symbolism, colors, even hidden meanings woven into the folds of robes or the placement of hands. You listen carefully because someday, if you're very lucky, you'll get to decide those things. And if you're extremely lucky, you'll live long enough to be remembered for them. But Florence is not kind to the slow or the unambitious. Competition is fierce, and talent alone is rarely enough. You need patrons, favors, connections, something most apprentices don't have. Some even attempt to curry favor by sneaking into the master's good graces with flattery, or worse, gossip about other apprentices. It's not uncommon to hear whispers of stolen sketches, of pigment jars mysteriously broken, or brushes ruined with vinegar. You start to learn that artistry is only part of the Renaissance game. Politics, even in a studio, is its own dark art. Then there are the tests, the unspoken ones. The master might hand you a half-finished background and tell you to continue it. No help, no hints. If you match his style perfectly, he might nod. If you fail, you might hear nothing. Silence can mean disappointment. Or it might mean he never intended to use that panel anyway, and just wanted to see if you could handle rejection. The real sting isn't even the failure. It's watching someone younger get a compliment the next day. Despite all this, you keep showing up. Every morning, before the sun warms the terracotta rooftops, you return to that studio. You grind. You mix. You stretch canvas. You copy. You listen. You carry planks and sweep floors and scrub brushes until your knuckles are raw. And slowly, so slowly, you begin to notice the change. Your lines become steadier. Your color sense sharpens. Your ear picks up the way the master paces when he's onto something brilliant. You still don't sign anything. You still eat last. But you're learning, you're enduring. And here, that's half the battle. One day, many years from now, perhaps someone will walk into a church, look at a panel you helped create, and feel moved. They won't know your name, but they'll feel something. And for now, maybe that's enough. Because in a 15th century Florentine workshop, glory comes slow, if it ever comes at all. But the work never stops. The paint was always dry before the light fades. And you, young apprentice, have pigment to grind? Chapter 2. A brush stroke from disaster. There's a fine line between genius and insufferable. And in Renaissance Florence, that line wasn't just crossed, it was stomped on repeatedly with muddy boots. You've now spent several years as an apprentice, and finally, you're painting. Not just backgrounds or borders, but actual figures. Hair, hands, the occasional cherub's wing. But every stroke you make is haunted by the breath of your master, who has a remarkable talent for appearing behind your shoulder exactly when you've made the tiniest mistake. This master, like many of the era, is a perfectionist, not in a casual, detail-oriented sense. In the soul-crushing, sleep-denying, brush-snapping sense, he barely sketches. He just moves intuitively, confidently. Paint flows where he wants it. Ask too many questions and you're called slow. Ask none and you're accused of arrogance. Others whisper he'd had enough. Either way, no one talks about it. When you ask where he went, the master shrugs and says, he didn't belong here. Weak fingers. As if fingers were the problem. It's not an actual wall, but a section of a mural or large panel where the master lets apprentices paint during a commission. Like when one of the younger apprentices accidentally dips a brush into egg yolk instead of varnish, smearing it across the saint's robe. The silence afterward is chilling. Everyone braces. The master walks over, stares at the disaster, then simply says, well, that saint is now a breakfast food, and walks away. The room explodes in quiet relief. Laughter that trembles on the edge of tears. It's both an honor and a trap. You take your spot near the pigments, mix your colors, adjust your brushes, and brace for whatever mood will walk through the door. The time the master forgot he'd hidden his wine inside a pigment jar and turned his Madonna's robes a faint burgundy. A brilliant, chaotic, possibly sleep-deprived man who once told a bishop he would paint the Virgin Mary with or without your theological input. The time he told a patron their baby had a wonderfully tragic face and meant it as a compliment. And if something goes wrong, a delivery delayed, a canvas warped, a patron demanding changes, you're the first to be blamed. Because to the master, your job is not just to assist. It's to make him look infallible. The time a pigeon flew through the studio window and landed, without hesitation, on a fresh panel, leaving a perfect little foot-shaped trail across the background. If your section turns out beautiful, the master might nod once and say, better than expected. If it fails, you'll be lucky to avoid a public shaming. Sometimes he invites patrons in early, just to see the progress. You watch nervously as they gaze at your section. Their eyes linger too long, your throat dries, and you silently pray they're just nearsighted. Not from illness, but from the knowledge that today might be the day he decides you're not worth it. That you'll be sent away like Tommaso, that someone else's brush will take your place. It's a dance of survival more than mentorship. And for some reason, he always seems to find the time to remind you of your provincial accent, your uneven lettering, or your tragically unmarketable face. Drapery curves in just the right way. Light touches the figures like it's been coached. You watch half in admiration, half in dread, knowing that same hand will grab your palette and smear your work without warning if your color mixes off by a tone. You'll never understand how a man can walk into a room filled with beauty-rich colors, sweeping lines, a heavenly composition, and still zero in on one brushstroke and ask coldly if your hand was trembling or if that's just your natural incompetence. He doesn't scream all the time. That would be too simple. No, he alternates. Not out of admiration, but because the favorite gets better meals, more access to commissions, and occasionally the privilege of sleeping indoors. You don't even know if you want to be his favorite, but you definitely don't want to be invisible. Cold silence, sudden rage, then flowery praise for another apprentice, just loud enough for you to hear. He speaks of art as if it drips from divine fingertips. He flatters the patron's daughter, makes comments about the shape of her nose being fit for Madonna. She blushes. You grind your teeth. After the door closes and the coins are handed over, he turns back to you and mutters, "Fix her face. She looks like a pastry." One day he's joking with the boys, tossing a fig across the workshop and laughing at a bawdy story. The next, he's flinging a wooden panel across the room because someone laid the underpainting too wet and ruined the layering. You quickly learn to read his mood the way others rid clouds before a storm. When the studio goes too quiet, you know the thunder is coming. Patrons don't see this side. When the nobleman arrives, the maestro becomes a different creature. Polished, charming, almost saintly. You fix it, because what choice do you have? Still, there's no denying his talent. Watching him paint is like witnessing a magician who doesn't believe in showing the trick. He doesn't teach, exactly. He demonstrates, and you're expected to absorb. One of the apprentices, Tommaso, left last week. He didn't say goodbye, just vanished one morning before dawn. Some say he found work in Siena. And now his place in the studio has become a source of quiet competition. Every apprentice wants to be the new favorite. There's a cruel sort of ritual in the studio known as the wall. But occasionally, the tension breaks in the most absurd ways. These are the moments you cling to, the rare bits of absurdity. These moments remind you that behind all the pretense, the rage, the divine genius, the master is still a man. But still, the pressure never lets up. The paintings must be finished. The colors must sing. You start waking up with a tightness in your chest. And yet, each morning, you come back. Because in Florence, in the 15th century, one bad brushstroke isn't just a mistake. It's a career-ending disaster. It's easy to assume that the Renaissance was an age of beauty, of clarity, of clean marble and glowing halos. But behind the scenes, in the back rooms of Florence's art world, the rhythm was far less graceful. If the master was the storm, the workshop was the boat, and you, the apprentice, were little more than a plank trying not to snap. Sometimes he wouldn't even yell when something went wrong. That was worse. Once, after days of carefully laying gold leaf on a commissioned altar panel, a gust of wind knocked the leafing tray from the table. The brilliant sheets fluttered into the air like butterflies, scattering everywhere, sticking to damp rags, the floor, even someone's hair. No one spoke. Not a single breath. The master just looked, not with anger, not with pity, just disappointment. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out. The silence stayed heavier than shouting ever could. And yet he had favorites. Every master did. One apprentice always got the best brushes. The ones with boar bristles that didn't shed. He got the closest seat during demonstrations, the first cut of roast meat when a commission bonus came in. His name was Giuliano, and he somehow managed to avoid both error and blame in the same breath. He was talented, yes, but also ... diplomatic. The kind of boy who knew when to praise the master's laugh and when to stay silent during one of his 2-hour rants about uninspired frescoes in this godforsaken town. It was both infuriating and impressive in a way. You once tried to mimic his technique subtly during your own section of a triptych. You adjusted your brushstroke, used a more delicate hand with the drapery. The master spotted it immediately. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Imitation is not innovation." Then he wiped your entire section with a damp cloth. That evening, you sat outside the studio alone, watching a dog nose through the garbage, and thought, maybe I'll become a baker. Bakers don't get screamed at by patrons for using the wrong kind of gold. Still, as strange as it sounds, you also learn to respect the chaos. Florence in the 5th-10th century didn't reward gentleness. It rewarded brilliance, and brilliance is rarely tidy. The master, for all his faults, delivered. His works were praised in churches, noted by scholars, whispered about in social gatherings. You overheard one visitor calling his depiction of Saint Jerome like a window to heaven, cracked open. And you, in some tiny way, had helped build that window. Even if it meant long hours, red eyes, and the constant threat of being replaced by a cousin from Bologna who supposedly had a steadier hand. Commissions weren't always religious. The Medici liked mythological scenes. Venus lounging in idealized nudity. Mars leaning dramatically on a spear. Those were tricky, because while Florence enjoyed indulgence in private, public art, still had to toe the line of decency. One time, the master was asked to paint a semi-nude Bacchus. The church protested. The patron offered double. The master agreed, then painted Bacchus with a leaf so enormous it sparked rumors that the model had been particularly blessed. Everyone pretended not to laugh. Everyone, that is, except the bishop, who later demanded the painting be moved somewhere less ... distracting. Then came the time the master took on a commission that nearly broke the entire studio. A wealthy banker wanted a ceiling mural of the 9 Muses. Grand, elaborate, expensive. The scale was enormous. The master accepted with a smile that sent shivers through your spine. "You'll learn something," he said. You did. You learned that scaffolding is terrifying? That ceilings are cursed. That paint drips directly into your eye if you angle the brush wrong. You spent weeks with your neck craned so far back, you developed what the others called studio neck. Eventually, your entire upper body felt like it had been sculpted by wrathful angels. But worse was the pressure. One mistake on a ceiling can't be easily fixed. It's visible. It's judged. And that banker visited often, his wide eyes darting over every corner, as if hoping to catch a flaw and bargain down the price. The master remained unbothered, or at least good at pretending. "Tell him it's nearly finished," he'd say, weeks before it was even half done. Tell him it's what inspiration looks like before it becomes genius. Somehow, it worked. You, on the other hand, were not allowed such poetic license. A brushstroke out of place, and you were sent back to preparing charcoal or repairing a cracked panel. It was a strange kind of economy. Praise flowed like wine at the top, and every drop below was sweat. There was also an unspoken rule in the workshop. Don't get too clever. The master didn't mind you showing initiative if it benefited him. But if it hinted that you might one day rival him, or worse, have your own ideas about style, then trouble began. One apprentice once tried to propose a different approach to a background scene, more naturalistic trees, a gentler light. The master listened quietly, then ordered him to repaint it using only black and white. "If you want to innovate," he said, "do it in your own studio." The message was clear. Until then, this was his world, and you were just visiting. And yet, you stayed, not out of fear or obligation, but because something inside you needed it. Despite everything, the long hours, the unpredictable moods, the aching joints, you couldn't walk away. Not when there was beauty at the end of it. Not when the master showed you a new technique for blending shadows. And you realized for the first time that you understood light, that you could make something glow. That day when he handed you the brush and said, "Finish the sleeve," your fingers trembled, but you did it. And when he looked over it afterward and didn't say a word, not praise, not scorn, you understood that sometimes silence was the highest compliment he could give. That night, you lay awake on your straw mat, sore, tired, and strangely satisfied. You had survived another day in the lion's den. And while your name might never grace the lips of Florentine society, while your work might be credited to a man who only occasionally remembered your existence, you knew deep down that part of that sleeve, that curve of fabric, was yours. And it would remain there long after both of you were dust. Chapter 3. The Secret Rivalry of Titans. There's a strange hum in Florence. Not the sound of carts or bells or the distant toll of church towers, but something beneath it. A tension. A quiet contest always on the verge of spilling into the open. And nowhere was that hum more distinct than between two of the most celebrated, most infuriating, and most thoroughly incompatible minds ever to paint a panel. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti. Genius doesn't play well with others, and these two were proof. At first glance, they couldn't be more different. Leonardo, charming, well-dressed, endlessly curious, and constantly distracted by his own thoughts. Michelangelo, blunt, scruffy, single-minded, and fueled by a level of intensity that bordered on feral. One walked the city in flowing robes, with a sketchbook under his arm, drawing anything from birds in flight to pulley systems for lifting cathedral domes. The other stormed through streets in worn-out boots, muttering about marble blocks and hurling insults at anyone who dared question his vision. You didn't want to be caught between them. Florence was small, the art world even smaller, and the social circles tighter still. But patrons liked to stir things up. They liked the idea of competition, of pushing their artists like chess pieces on a grand board. It was great entertainment, after all, to pit one genius against another, especially if you were footing the bill. The trouble truly began when both were commissioned to paint opposite walls of the same hall. The Hall of 500 and the Palazzo Vecchio. 2 murals, 2 legends, 1 room. A setup so perfect it could have been scripted by a Renaissance playwright with a flair for drama. Leonardo was to paint the Battle of Anghiari. Michelangelo, the Battle of Cascina. Both scenes of Florentine military triumph. Both massive, muscular, and charged with motion. But their approaches couldn't have been more different. Leonardo tinkered. He experimented with wax-based paints that never quite dried. He made hundreds of preparatory sketches, studied anatomy, explored how emotions twisted the human face during combat. Michelangelo, on the other hand, charged forward like a bull. His figures weren't just anatomically correct, they were mythic. Every muscle flexed, every body poised in the agony of movement. His battle scene wasn't just war, it was sculpture come alive, and yet they hated each other. Not the playful rivalry you might imagine. Not the kind that ended in a handshake and a shared toast at the tavern. This was pure disdain. Leonardo dismissed Michelangelo as coarse, uncultured, obsessed with the grotesque. Michelangelo accused Leonardo of being all talk and no delivery. Once in public, Leonardo mocked Michelangelo for his obsession with male anatomy, saying he could carve a perfect thigh but couldn't paint a woman to save his life. Michelangelo, not to be outdone, snapped back that at least he finished his commission. A jab at Leonardo's reputation for abandoning projects halfway through. They avoided each other when they could, but Florence made that difficult. Their paths crossed often, at guild meetings, in the patron salons, at feasts. The tension was thick enough to carve. And the apprentices knew. You could tell who worked for whom by how they stood. Leonardo's students had ink-stained fingers and complexions pale from candlelight experiments. Michelangelo's boys had bandaged hands and permanent frowns from carrying marble slabs up hills. And yet, despite their differences, they needed each other. Not emotionally, of course, but professionally. Florence wasn't a meritocracy. It was a theater. The louder your name echoed, the more you were paid, protected, and preserved in memory, and rivalry kept people talking. It drew the patrons in, made every sketch valuable, every whisper at dinner suddenly meaningful. When the Pope asked Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel's ceiling, many claimed he was chosen precisely because Leonardo had failed to complete similar grand commissions. Their feud took strange turns. Once, Leonardo wrote a treatise on human proportion. Michelangelo responded not with writing, but with sculpture. A nude David, perfectly proportioned, perfectly poised. Some whispered he placed it outside the city's main government building on purpose, so Leonardo would pass it often. Others swore Leonardo once sketched a mechanical device meant to carry Michelangelo's statues and accidentally broke it in front of the whole studio. Whether these stories were true didn't matter. They were repeated. They fueled the myth. The rivalry had taken on a life of its own. What's fascinating is how differently they saw the world. Leonardo saw systems. Nature, machines, light, motion, thought. He dissected things not just physically, but conceptually. He was known to sketch the same hand 50 different ways, chasing the perfect gesture. Michelangelo saw struggle. He believed in wresting the soul from stone. He didn't paint people as they were. He painted them as they ought to be in all their divine suffering and muscular glory. While Leonardo might take a week to render the subtle shadow beneath an Michelangelo would carve a 6-foot figure in 3 days. Fueled by anger, bread, and what some described as sheer spite, their patrons played them like rival composers. When one agreed to paint a virgin, the other was suddenly asked to paint a more beautiful, more expensive one. When one designed a tomb, the other was commissioned to design a larger, more celestial one across town, and they knew it. Neither was oblivious to the game, but neither backed down. Because to walk away was to admit defeat, and yet, in the strangest twist of all, both never completed their Palazzo Vecchio murals. Leonardo's wax technique failed. The painting melted and smeared, forcing him to abandon it. Michelangelo was pulled away to Rome before finishing even the first full figure. 2 titans, 2 brilliant minds, 2 grand visions, finished, unpreserved. All that remains now are copies, sketches, descriptions by those who saw the original beginnings. The rivalry burned so brightly that it left a shadow on the walls, even without the paintings themselves. A kind of artistic ghost story. And here's the final irony. Despite the insults, the bitterness, the competition, the two are now often spoken of in the same breath. Their names paired together in textbooks, museums, lecture halls, eternal rivals immortalized side by side. They would have hated that. If there's one thing that Florence never lacked, it was opinions. And when it came to the rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo, the city had plenty. It was also fear. Both men, for all their accomplishments, lived under the constant pressure of expectation. Florence was unforgiving. Fame was fleeting. But what people forget is that his mind wasn't built for completion. It was built for exploration. But once he didn't stop. He ate with his fingers while sculpting. One day, Michelangelo saw a painting of Leonardo as in a chapel and muttered that the angels looked like well-dressed merchants with wings. Another time, Leonardo publicly rolled his eyes at Michelangelo's sculptural style, calling it exaggerated, like a Greek myth after too much wine. He slept in his clothes for days while finishing a figure. Artists were driven to innovate, to push techniques, to find new ways to express the divine, the human, the symbolic. He traveled, worked in Milan and France, served kings, and continued sketching mad inventions until the end. He sculpted and painted until his fingers twisted with arthritis. Their unfinished murals in the Palazzo Vecchio were eventually painted over, covered by newer work, hidden but not erased. Scholars still debate whether the ghosts of their paintings remain beneath the layers. If fragments of brushstrokes, fragments of war horses and soldiers' faces, still sleep within the plaster, waiting to be found. He lived long longer than most, long enough to see people call him the greatest artist who ever lived. And yet, even then, he never stopped working. Their standards were impossible, and their presence in the city made every stroke of your brush feel like a test. When asked why he continued sculpting into his 80s, he reportedly said, "Ancora imparo. I am still learning." He died with his notebook still full of unfinished thoughts, one hand stained with ink. Some say he died in the arms of the French king. Others say he died alone. No one's sure. The two greatest minds of their time locked in competition over paintings that were never completed. Masterpieces lost to time. Their rivalry preserved not in canvas, but in memory, myth, and unfinished dreams. What is sure is that even in death, he left more questions than answers. Workshops became laboratories of technique. Fresco became political. Portraits turned into philosophical statements. The city itself was shaped by their work and their war. Michelangelo once reportedly said that Leonardo's horse designs for a monument were too ambitious to live. Some artists align themselves clearly with one camp or the other, wearing their loyalty like a badge. Others tried to play both sides, flattering Leonardo's subtle compositions while admiring Michelangelo's sculptural drawings. This rarely ended well. If Michelangelo suspected you were a Leonardesco, you were out. And Leonardo, ever more gracious in tone, but no less ruthless, would simply stop inviting you to his salon nights. But also too perfect to ignore. And Leonardo, despite all his barbs, would occasionally linger near Michelangelo's finished statues, studying them just a little too long for someone who claimed not to care. He carved until his hands bled, then kept going. He wasn't interested in beauty, at least not the kind that flattered. He wanted raw truth, the kind that made people uncomfortable. The kind that stared back at you from a block of marble with such intensity you forgot it wasn't alive. He started ideas that were so far ahead of his time they read like science fiction. Flying machines, mechanical knights, even city sanitation systems. He would vanish into a design for days, then return with a sketch of something no one could even name. One of his assistants once joked that Leonardo could invent a device to bottle lightning, but would lose interest before screwing on the lid. Patrons could adore you one year and drop you the next for the newest prodigy in town. Even a single failed work could ruin your name. So this rivalry, in some way, kept both of them sharp, always watching, always improving, always trying to outdo a ghost who lived only a few streets away. Tavern whispers, court gossip, heated arguments between young artists over which of the two was truly the genius of the age. Everyone had a side, even if they'd never seen a single painting up close. You might be walking down a street and overhear someone say, "Leonardo could capture a soul with a line," only to hear another scoff and mutter, "But Michelangelo could pull divinity from stone." And just like that, the debate would begin again, looping endlessly like an unfinished sketch. It wasn't all ego, though there was plenty of that. Leonardo, with his notebooks, his endless sketches of birds, clouds, and water patterns, was often criticized for never finishing. Michelangelo, on the other hand, didn't start many things. And still, they circled each other, like twin stars spinning in orbit, never touching but constantly influencing. But even they couldn't deny each other's brilliance. There were others caught in the crossfire. Apprentices, patrons, critics. Many tried to use the rivalry to their advantage. One of the strangest results of their rivalry was how it forced Florence to evolve artistically. No one could stay neutral. But eventually all storms tire. Time, which waits for no genius, caught up with them both. Leonardo left Florence first. Michelangelo stayed. Florence, once the stage of their rivalry, moved on. New artists rose. New techniques took hold. But the echoes of their conflict never quite faded. And that, perhaps, is the most poetic twist of all. If you were an artist in Florence, then you might admire them. You might envy them. But more likely, you feared them because their shadow was long, and you, with your aching back, your half-filled sketchbook, your quiet hopes, well, you wouldn't last long trying to keep up with titans. Not when the wind of their names still stirred the very dust of the workshop floor. Chapter 4. The Sculptor's Torment. There's a silence in the sculptor's studio. That's different from a painter's. It's not the quiet hum of brushes or whispered critique. It's heavier, almost sacred. The only sounds are the rhythmic taps of chisels and the occasional crack sharp and final when stone yields. In Florence, where painting might earn you the admiration of merchants, sculpture brought you closer to God, or so they claimed. But what no one mentioned was how often it brought you to your knees, literally, covered in marble dust, sweat in your eyes, blood on your knuckles. This wasn't artistry. This was survival with a hammer. The first lesson every apprentice sculptor learned wasn't about anatomy or proportion. It was about weight. Stone is heavy. Not just in the physical sense, though your spine would argue otherwise after dragging a block across the floor. But in presence, in permanence, you can revise a painting, add color, remove a face, but with stone, one bad cut and the entire figure is gone. You aren't just carving, you're gambling. The blocks arrived dirty, raw, often with chips or veins that had to be worked around. Carrara marble was prized for its clarity, but even the finest stone had hidden flaws. A thin crack deep inside could turn into a catastrophe weeks, into a project. You learned to knock on the marble, to listen. A hollow sound meant danger. A dull thud meant promise. And yet, even with that knowledge, mistakes happened. They always did. One sculptor, an older apprentice with thick hands and a permanent limp, once spent months carving the torso of a saint. It was beautiful, muscular, balanced, alive. He began on the head next, a single errant chisel strike, a tremor in his wrist from fatigue, and the nose shattered. Not cracked, shattered. The head was ruined, the saint decapitated. The master said nothing. He simply covered the torso with a cloth and told the boy to start again. The studio didn't speak of it, but no one forgot, especially not the apprentice. He left 2 weeks later, never returned. Marble sculpting was romantic only from a distance. Up close, it was blistered palms, swollen knuckles, and cold mornings where your breath fogged in front of your face while you bent over a slab for hours. Gloves weren't common. Control came from skin-to-tool contact. And so every cut, every scrape, every slip of the chisel left a mark, not just on the stone, but on you. Then there was the dust. It coated everything. Your hair, your lashes, the inside of your nostrils. It stuck to sweat and turned into a paste on your skin. You coughed it out at night, your lungs aching, your throat raw. Older sculptors often developed what they called stone lung, a quiet wheezing companion that stayed with them long after they put down their tools. But still, there was something about it, about watching form emerge from formlessness. You could take a shapeless hunk of rock and reveal a saint's outstretched hand, a virgin's sorrowful gaze, a wing unfolding from a slab. It felt like pulling life from death, and when you got it right, when the light hit the curves just so it didn't matter that your arms were shaking or that your boots were filled with powder, in that moment you were divine. At least until the master walked in and declared the thigh too narrow. Sculpture was expensive, risky. A single statue required weeks of labor, tools that dulled constantly, scaffolding, polishing stones, wax for sealing. Patrons wanted miracles, but paid as if they were buying turnips, and they always had opinions. They wanted their faces on David, their wives on angels, their family crest somewhere discreet but visible. You weren't just carving beauty. You were carving politics, vanity, and fear of death. The wealthy wanted to be remembered in stone, but never as they truly were. Always taller, leaner, more noble. In sculpture, truth was edited permanently. You quickly learned that not all stone was created equal. Poorer patrons might commission in Petrus Arena, softer gray stone used in architecture. It chipped easily, cracked faster, and weathered badly outdoors. But it was cheaper. You carved with care, but knew it would never last. Your efforts were temporary by design. Meanwhile, the high churchmen demanded alabaster or even rare Greek marbles. Beautiful, yes, but finicky. One flake off the wrong corner, and the surface would never polish smooth again. Some days, the worst wasn't the physical toll, it was the repetition. Carving curls of hair over and over. Draped cloth, fold after fold. Fingers and toes, always the same, always difficult. You spend hours getting the spacing between two fingers right, only to realize the arm was positioned wrong. Back to chiseling. Back to squinting in candlelight, trying to measure from memory and the faint scratches on your guide drawing. And the guide drawing probably changed 3 times already because the patron's wife didn't like how her neck looked. One of the more surreal aspects of working in sculpture was how many commissions were funerary. You spent your youth sculpting tombs, carving faces of men who were already dead or who paid you early because they planned to be. You shaped angels into mournful poses, designed sarcophagi with intricate battle scenes, and even carved epitaphs you didn't fully understand. It wasn't just art, it was legacy. And it made death feel oddly mundane. Sometimes, at night, the older sculptors would drink and joke that the only ones who truly appreciated their work were the ones who couldn't see it. There was a dark humor to it. After all, how many statues had they carved that no one ever visited again? How many masterpieces were tucked into corners of crypts, slowly gathering dust, while the world above changed and moved on? And still they carved. You watched them work and wondered if you could do it forever, if your back could survive another 10 years bent over stone, if your wrists could hold out, if your ears would ever stop ringing from the clang of hammer on chisel. The answer wasn't clear. But you knew this. In Florence, sculpture was more than art. It was sacrifice, and not the dramatic, poetic kind. The daily gritty kind. The kind that left your hands calloused and your name unknown. And yet, when a finished figure finally emerged, smooth, radiant, unmistakably alive, you felt it. That flicker. That hope that maybe, in the end, someone would look at what you made and see more than stone. They might even see you. You learn to listen to the stone, not in a mystical, magical way, just practically. Every tap of the chisel speaks. Every vibration that travels up the handle into your palm tells you something. If it's too sharp, you're striking too deep. If it sings too high, the edge is brittle. If it thuds, your hammer's dulled again. And yet, despite all this listening, the stone never really answers back. It just waits, cold, unmoving, until you shape it into something that finally makes people pause. There's a story older sculptors love to tell, though no one's sure if it's true. They say that when Michelangelo first saw the block of marble that would become his David, others had already rejected it. Too narrow, too veined, damaged at the top. A flawed block, but he saw something in it, not a statue, not even a boy, just potential. And when he finished, when the 20-foot figure finally stood unveiled, barefoot and impossibly alive, people cried. Not out of patriotism or piety, but because they'd never imagined stone could look so awake. Now you know better, you know what the public never sees? That behind every beautiful statue is a pile of discarded chisels. A dozen bent wrists and weeks of someone quietly losing their mind over a single eyebrow ridge. They see the result and assume genius. They never consider the boredom, the repetition, the sheer physical grind of coaxing a kneecap out of marble dust. There's also the isolation. Painters might talk while they work, but sculptors don't. The noise of hammering makes conversation impossible. And even if it didn't, you need both hands, full attention, and an almost meditative rhythm. You spend hours in your own head, chipping away at the stone, then at your doubts. Some days you hear your master's criticisms echo in your mind, even when he's not in the room. Too shallow, too soft, too flat. And occasionally you believe him. Patrons rarely visit this studio during carving. Too messy, too noisy, too dusty. But when they do come, it's always the same. They circle the half-finished statue with a furrowed brow, nodding as if they understand anything about weight distribution or block geometry. Then they make an offhand comment. Can his expression be more ... it? Can the drapery be lighter? Lighter, in stone. You smile politely and promise to make it happen. Then you go home and scream into a bag of sawdust. Finishing a statue doesn't mean the work is done. There's sanding, polishing, sealing, transporting. The final touches can take as long as the carving itself. And that's where the real nerves begin. Because once it leaves the studio, it's out of your hands, sometimes literally. One artist's entire statue cracked in half when it was dropped during delivery. Months of work, gone in a heartbeat. Another sculptor's figure arrived at the patron's villa with its nose snapped clean off. They blamed the cart driver. He blamed the cobblestones. The artist? He blamed himself quietly for not carving a sturdier bridge across the nose. But sculpture isn't just figures. It's columns, fountains, reliefs on church walls. You might spend a whole season just chiseling Latin text into a tomb slab. Hours of carving letters. Clean, even, precise. If your spacing is wrong by even a finger's width, the whole inscription looks crooked, and heaven forbid you misspell something in Latin. There's a famous grave near San Marco where a sculptor carved requiescat instead of requiescat. It became a city joke. They called him the resting fool until he died, which, ironically, they spelled correctly on his own tomb. Of course, not everything is tragedy. Some days the studio is filled with golden morning light, and the marble seems to glow from within. The air smells like stone dust and oil, and your muscles move without thinking. You look down and realize you've carved an arm and knee, a fold of cloth, and it's perfect. Or close enough that you don't flinch when the master inspects it. Those moments are rare, like catching lightning in a wine bottle. But when they come, they're better than sleep. Then there are the rumors of statues that bleed, of faces so lifelike priests feared them. One tale tells of a sculptor who made a Madonna so real the local bishop refused to let it be displayed. A man should not feel unworthy in front of a statue, he said. Another story claims that a statue of Saint Sebastian was so delicately pierced that when rainwater fell through the holes, it looked like the figure was crying. These stories aren't true, probably, but they're believed. And in Florence, belief is half the battle. And yet, through all the myths and sweat, the broken tools and patron complaints, you stay. Because there's something addictive about the process, about watching a shape emerge from chaos. It makes you feel like a god with dust in his lungs and calluses on his fingers. The work might kill you, but you'll die knowing you left behind something that might outlive even the city's towers. As you stand there, one boot resting on a discarded shard of stone, you take a breath and look at your work. Not quite finished, not quite right, but close. You run your palm over the smooth surface of a newly shaped cheekbone. Cold, solid, waiting. And tomorrow you'll return. You'll sand. You'll chisel. You'll curse the dust and bless the light. Because you're a sculptor in Florence, and quitting, well, quitting is for people with soft hands. Chapter 5. Guilds and Gatekeepers. In Renaissance Florence, talent alone wasn't enough. It didn't matter how skilled your brush, how precise your chisel, or how grand your ideas. If you wanted to rise, to be recognized, to work legally, and be paid with coin rather than leftover bread crusts, you needed to belong to the guild. The Arte dei Medici Speziali. A mouthful, yes, but one of the most powerful and deeply entrenched guilds in all of Florence. It was the gatekeeper of artistic legitimacy, and if you weren't inside, you were nobody. At first, the guild's name makes little sense. Doctors and apothecaries. What does that have to do with painters and sculptors? But the answer is in the ingredients. Paint wasn't just art, it was chemistry. Pigments were ground minerals, oils were medicinal, resins used in both painting and treating wounds. The early painters relied on apothecaries to provide their materials, and as the profession grew, so did its alignment with the guild. Eventually, painters became a subset under its powerful umbrella. And with that, a hierarchy was born. To get in, you didn't just submit a sample of your work. You needed approval, sponsors, connections, paperwork, sometimes a well-placed bribe. And even then, you might be rejected on a technicality. Maybe you hadn't trained under a recognized master. Maybe your family lacked a clean reputation. Or maybe someone whispered something in the ear of the wrong person at the wrong dinner. Whatever the reason, if the guild doors didn't open for you, your career ended before it began. Being in the guild wasn't glamorous. It came with dues. Lots of dues. Monthly payments, fees for using the seal, fees for participating in public events, and fees simply for being included in the registry. You also had to attend meetings, many of which were spent arguing over minor points of regulation or whether the new generation of artists were too experimental with their anatomy. But without that seal stamped on every contract, every piece of correspondence, you were considered an amateur, or worse, a fraud. The guild also protected its own. If you were robbed, they might help you recover losses. If a patron refused to pay, the guild could blacklist him, barring other artists from working with him until he settled his debts. They even had a legal advocate who would pursue claims in the city courts. But that protection came with control. If you produced a work deemed scandalous, a saint with a slightly too modern jawline, you could be censured, fined, banned. That was only if they were feeling lenient. Some tried to go around the guild. Quiet commissions, off-the-book sales, work done through intermediaries. But these were risky. Guild agents were everywhere, watching, listening. A rumor of unregistered work could bring penalties not just to you, but to the entire workshop. And if caught, you'd face more than a fine. You'd be barred permanently, a fate worse than poverty. Because without a guild, you weren't just unemployed, you were invisible. The guilds also controlled apprenticeships. Who could take them, how long they lasted, and what they could legally be taught. There were stories of workshops being raided for keeping too many apprentices or using them on projects before they were officially registered. One master was fined heavily after letting his nephew paint part of a Madonna without formal approval. The painting itself, gorgeous, but unauthorized. That alone was enough to trigger penalties. And yet, despite all this red tape, every artist dreamed of entry. Because once inside, your name was carved into stone. Literally. The guild kept detailed records, updating them yearly. If you made enough of a name for yourself, your portrait might hang in the guild hall, staring down at future members with a look of smug, powdered triumph. More importantly, being a member opened doors to higher commissions, churches, palaces, even government buildings. The guild stamp on your contract was like a badge of honor. The Arte wasn't the only guild, of course. Florence had dozens: wool merchants, bankers, masons, butchers, smiths, each with its own traditions, feasts, internal politics. But the Artists' Guild was different. It dealt not just in product, but in perception. The city cared deeply about image. Every painting, every sculpture, every architectural detail was a message about wealth, power, and piety. And the guild controlled who got to send that message. Of course, the guilds were also deeply tied to Florence's political machinery. The Medici knew this. They courted guild leaders, invited them to dinners, placed their sons in key guild positions. Being favored by the Medici didn't just mean better jobs. It meant fewer inspections, faster approvals, and occasionally, a blind eye turned when your workshop accidentally went over apprentice quotas. You, as an up-and-coming artist, couldn't ignore this web of influence. Navigating the guild wasn't just about talent. It was about knowing who to flatter, who to avoid, and when to smile and nod in meetings where no one really wanted you to speak. The older members often looked at you with a kind of polite disinterest until your name began to circulate. Until a prominent merchant said your work reminded him of Fra Angelico. Then they start noticing, not because of merit. Because of momentum, that's the part they never teach you in the studio. That being an artist in Florence was as much politics as pigment. That for every genius who soared, 10 others were pushed down by bureaucracy, jealousy, or a single whispered rumor. The guild, while protective, was not your friend. It was a lion you had to ride carefully, skillfully, and with both eyes open. And so you filed your papers, paid your dues, and tried to avoid stepping on toes. You played the long game. Hoped for commissions that would get you noticed. Practiced your smile for dinners you couldn't afford to attend. And when the guild finally admitted you, handed you that stamped document with your name carved neatly across it, you felt something strange. Pride, yes, relief, but also the heavy weight of expectation. Because now you weren't just a hopeful apprentice. You were an artist of Florence. And Florence, as it so often reminded you, had a long memory and very short patience. Now that you've been accepted, at least on parchment, Into the Arte dei Medici Speciali, you'd think your path would smooth out. Finally, after years of slogging through plaster, tempera, and masterful scoldings, you've crossed the threshold into professional legitimacy. But this isn't a finish line, it's just the start of a more complex maze. You're no longer an anonymous laborer, you're now visible, which means the scrutiny doubles. Your name is in a ledger, yes, but so is every late fee, every workshop inspection, every complaint lodged by a rival. Guild life is not glamorous. You attend quarterly meetings that feel more like polite standoffs than collaboration. There's always someone loudly arguing over pigment, import duties, or complaining that the newer artists are copying styles without paying homage to their sources. One man in particular, Benedetto, a gray-bearded oil painter who once worked on a ducal chapel, loves to corner apprentices and rant about the decline of discipline. He swears the guild was better before all these boys started mixing Flemish shadowing into their Madonna portraits. You nod respectfully, trying not to mention that Benedetto hasn't sold a single painting in 3 years. Then there's the matter of competition. Now that you're officially in the system, you find yourself constantly compared. Your commissions are discussed. Your name is murmured in guild halls with the same enthusiasm usually reserved for wine prices and plague statistics. Some praise you, others dismiss you. The ones you fear the most are the ones who smile to your face and then quietly undermine you behind the curtain. For example, you finally get a modest commission, an Annunciation scene for a private chapel. It's not grand, but it's yours. The patron, a well-to-do wool merchant, seems pleased. Then suddenly he retracts. Says he's heard you may not have the right credentials for sacred works. You're stunned. You've trained, registered, paid your dues. Later, you find out it was another artist, a guild member, older, insecure, who suggested over dinner that your figures lacked proper theological modesty. Just a whisper. But in Florence, a whisper can echo louder than a trumpet. You try to shake it off. You paint anyway. You submit smaller works, portraits, devotional panels. You play the game as best you can, but the guild is like a walled garden with thorny paths. To stay in favor, you need to remain useful, visible, uncontroversial, and yet the city demands innovation. If you do what's expected, you're boring. If you push too far, you're reckless. Finding the balance is an art in itself. Then there are the guild inspections. These are irregular and unannounced. A pair of middle-aged men in heavy robes and polished shoes arrive at your studio one morning, sniff the air, inspect your pigment jars, measure your workspace, and quietly take notes. They ask if your assistants are properly registered. They count brushes, check for unauthorized prints or copied sketches. One of them lifts your drawing panel and inspects the back like it might confess something. You smile through it, sweating. Because even if you've done everything right, one loose claim say that you used a band binding agent, or that your studio isn't up to fire regulations, and suddenly you're defending your livelihood before a disciplinary council of men who wouldn't know a decent background wash if it bit them. To make things worse, the Arte has begun to favor a more conservative style in recent years. The newer works praised in guild bulletins are reverent, formal, stiff. You feel your brush wanting to wander more dynamic poses, richer color palettes, even secular subjects, but the memory of that wool merchant haunts you. So you toe the line. For now, ironically, some of the most well-connected guild members barely paint anymore. They trade in influence, not images. One such man, Master Tommaso Della Vecchia, hasn't completed a panel in over a decade. And yet, his name graces 3 current cathedral commissions because he knows how to distribute work, hire subcontractors, and speak the right Latin phrases during public mass. You saw one of his collaborative altarpieces last month. You recognized the work of 2 younger artists, neither of whom got credit. And so the truth becomes clear. In the guild, power matters more than paint. Talent opens the door, but charm and cunning keep it open. You begin to understand why some artists choose to work under the radar, outside the official walls. But you also know how dangerous that path can be. Still, you keep going, you pay your dues, you learn which events to attend, which patrons to compliment, which rivalries to avoid. You teach yourself how to navigate the subtle language of commissions. You even begin to gain notice. A bishop requests a panel. A noblewoman requests a portrait. And slowly your name climbs the list, not to the top, but high enough to stop being questioned. One day, during a feast celebrating the guild's anniversary, you're handed a silver goblet of wine and ushered to a table near the head of the room. The guildmaster toasts you as one of our promising younger members. It feels good. Until you glance down the table and see the smirk of another artist who once accused you of stealing a design. The game, it seems, never ends. Still, there are moments of beauty. Quiet afternoons where the light falls just right on a panel you're gilding. The rich smell of varnish mingling with rosemary from a nearby garden. The sound of bells in the distance as you step back to view your own work and, for a breath, feel something close to peace. Florence is many things, magnificent, exhausting, fickle. The guild is no different. It shelters you, shapes you, and though it may never love you, it will remember you. Or at least the part of you etched in paint and plaster and wax-sealed contracts. You once thought talent would be enough. Now you know better. Now you know that to survive in a 15th century Florentine guild, you need more than skill. You need endurance, tact, and just a hint of healthy paranoia. And maybe, just maybe, a few extra florins hidden in a jar, in case someone decides your paperwork needs re-examining. Chapter 6. Ink-stained Genius. The smell hits you first. Not quite foul, but dense and overwhelming mix of hot wax, ink, damp parchment, and burnt oil. The Renaissance print shop is alive in its own way, but it breathes heavier than a painter's studio or sculptor's shed. There's less romance in the air and more grease, the kind that stains your fingertips for days and doesn't wash out even with a full bucket of well water. You've stepped into a world of precision, politics, and paranoia, and you're already behind on your quota. Printing, despite its miraculous reputation, is not the delicate art many believe it to be. It's mechanical, repetitive, unforgiving. Letters must be carved backward, pressed precisely, and arranged with the patience of a monk cataloging scripture. One misaligned piece of type, and an entire page is ruined. If you think spilling red pigment on a panel earns you trouble, try printing a theological text with a missing letter in the word, salvation. Suddenly you're not just sloppy, you're a heretic. The press itself dominates the room. A hulking wooden structure with iron screws and a lever that takes the weight of your whole body to pull. It moans with every page, groaning like an old church pew. Around it, a flurry of assistants shuffle parchment, mix ink from soot and linseed oil, and reset type blocks, their eyes bleary and hands blackened. The apprentices here don't walk, they shuffle, heads down, backs curved like question marks from long hours bending over type trays. And the master printer, he's not an artist in the traditional sense. He's a businessman, a technician, a craftsman, and a gambler all rolled into one, because every new print run is a risk. Books are expensive to produce, and readers are fickle. If you print too few, you miss your chance. If you print too many, you lose your coin. And if you print the wrong book well, the consequences aren't just financial. They're ecclesiastical. The church watches printing houses closely, very closely, especially in Florence. The freedom of print is both a revolution and a threat, and those in power know it. The wrong phrase in a theological pamphlet, the wrong tone in a philosophical essay, and suddenly you're on trial for spreading dangerous ideas, not always on purpose. Sometimes a single word, taken out of context, is enough. There's a case of a printer in Venice who accidentally inverted 2 Latin lines in a psalter. The local bishop declared it blasphemous. The entire run was burned. The printer's shop was closed for months. His apprentice disappeared. No one asked questions. This kind of risk means that printers must be careful with more than just ink. They develop a whole secondary language to discuss controversial material. A sunrise volume means something radical. A cloudy day edition might carry criticisms of state leaders. If the book is described as touched by Hermes, it's probably illegal in at least 2 principalities. And yet, People flock to the presses. Writers, thinkers, poets, hungry minds who see print as the future. They bring handwritten manuscripts, rolled scrolls, pages full of ideas they believe must be seen. Some of it is brilliant. Some of it is dangerous. Some of it is unreadable. The master printer accepts the commission, nods gravely, and immediately starts calculating how many copies might sell and whether the local bishop has a sense of humor. You, the new assistant, are told to stand at the ink table. Your job is to maintain consistency. Same pigment thickness, same distribution, same coverage. Too little ink, and the pages faint. Too much, and the letters bleed. You try your best, but it's harder than it looks. The ink coagulates faster in cold air, and some days the humidity warps the parchment before you can even print. The press foreman walks by, glances at your third batch of sheets, and says nothing, just clicks his tongue. It's worse than shouting. Then there's the manual labor of the press itself, lifting lead blocks, arranging the type, locking them into the frame. Every page must be tested. You print a proof, hold it up to the window, check the spacing, reset the block, print again, and again, and again. By the end of the day, your fingers ache, your vision blurs, and your apron is stiff with ink. You eat with your hands stained, and everything tastes vaguely like soot. But there's a strange power here, a hum under the exhaustion. Because this isn't just printing, this is multiplication. In a single day, one idea can leap from 10 minds to 100. A book that once took a monk 3 years to copy can now be reproduced in a week. Knowledge is faster than ever before. It no longer belongs only to cloisters and kings. Now, a curious merchant's son or a stubborn peasant with coin can own a book, read a poem, ponder a new kind of prayer. And that terrifies the old world. The city is already whispering. They say the presses are spreading heresy, that poets are corrupting the young, that philosophy should stay in the universities, not be handed out like bread, and so rules come down. Licenses, censors, watchdogs. You start to see more cloaked figures outside the shop, more questions, more papers to sign. One afternoon, a book is quietly removed from the shelves. The printer calls it a seasonal revision. Later, you overhear someone say the author was arrested in Pisa. You don't ask. You don't want to know, but you notice the master printer burns all the extra copies in a sealed iron drum that night. No explanation. Just ashes. Still, for all the danger, there's excitement too. When a batch of love poems rolls hot off the press, and girls in the market start quoting them aloud. When a philosophical essay sparks a tavern debate that goes deep into the night. When you see an old man in a worn cloak reading a printed psalm on a bench, tears in his eyes, you begin to believe just a little that maybe ink is more powerful than paint or stone or gold. But then the bell rings, another commission, another cautious scroll from a nobleman, another round of licensing forms and nervous glances, and back you go to the ink, the press, the risk. Because in Florence in the 15th century, printing isn't just the future, it's a fire, and you're one wrong word away from being burned. There are quiet acts of rebellion happening every day in the back rooms of Florence's print shops. You wouldn't notice them unless you knew where to look. A deliberately ambiguous phrase in a footnote, an author's name replaced with a pseudonym, a missing page number, or a controversial idea once sat. The printed word may appear calm on the surface, but underneath it's twitching with tension. Every sentence is a tightrope. The master printer, despite his strict manner, is a man of contradictions. He pretends to follow the church's rules to the letter, keeps a copy of the Vulgate open on his desk, quotes scripture to the bishop's men, nods solemnly at every new regulation. But tucked beneath a loose floorboard in his private chamber is a stack of banned manuscripts, a Greek text on astronomy, a copy of Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, even a few Latin poems by Petrarch with the more romantic stanzas underlined. He doesn't read them often, he just likes to know they're there. A private rebellion? The kind no one speaks of unless you want to disappear. You've been with the shop long enough now to earn some trust. Not a lot, just enough that you're asked to carry messages to certain scholars. Quiet men who live in large homes with dusty windows and far too many candles. When you arrive, they don't greet you by name. They simply hold out a hand for the letter, then nod once and close the door. Later, a new manuscript arrives. For private distribution, the printer says, you know better than to ask questions. But questions swirl anyway. Why are certain texts printed only at night? Why are some delivered in sealed pouches to nobles who request anonymity? Why do some patrons pay double just to keep their name off the record? There are things about print that feel less like art and more like espionage. And if you're smart, you learn quickly which topics are safe religious meditations, medical texts, moral fables, and which topics invite inspection. Anything on politics, the cosmos, or reform is a potential fire starter. One evening, while cleaning the press, you find a half-set page left under a stack of proofs. It's in Latin, but you've seen enough to recognize the structure. It's a challenge to church corruption, disguised as a discussion of ancient Roman ethics. The author is unknown, but the tone is biting. Someone's about to light a fire with words. You bring it to the master. He reads it once, sighs, and tucks it into his coat. The next morning, he tells you it was never printed, that it was an early draft, meant for review only. You nod, but when you return to the studio that night, the form is gone. Not in a waste pile. Not in the fire barrel. Gone. That's how it goes. The press is both a blessing and a blade. One wrong turn and it will cut you down. But if used right, it can open doors no one ever knew existed. Entire communities are reading now. Merchants, weavers, even the occasional stonemason. You see a young woman selling oranges at the corner recite a line from a new devotional she couldn't have possibly heard in church. You realize that ideas are no longer trapped in cathedrals and salons. They're seeping into the fabric of the street. Of course, the church responds. A new edict arrives from Rome. All printed works must now bear the stamp of approval from a diocesan review board. Every book must include a final page listing its date, origin, and supervising authority. Suddenly, the print shop is flooded with paperwork. More forms, more visitors, more excuses to be shut down. The master grumbles, but obeys. Outwardly, inwardly, the shop adapts. Some texts now bear forged stamps. Others use alternate spellings to confuse inquisitors. Florenzia, instead of Florence. A different date, a false scribe. One assistant is caught slipping unapproved pamphlets into market stalls. He's dismissed quietly, not punished, just erased. His name scratched out of the records. The master warns you, if you're going to be bold, be careful. If you're going to be careless, be quiet. Still, not all print is scandalous. There's beauty too. Poetry, copied and distributed for the first time in volume. Recipes, love letters. Treatises on architecture and art. An illustrated guide to local plants that becomes wildly popular among apothecaries. There's even a children's tale, The Goat and the Cypress, that sells out in 3 days. The artist who illustrated it is offered work from 3 different guilds, just for her woodcut of a goat standing proudly on a hill. But even these innocent works are dangerous in their own way, because they shift who gets to learn, who gets to laugh, who gets to imagine. The power of print isn't just in what it says. It's in who hears it. And once the story enters someone's home, there's no pulling it back. Eventually, your own hands begin to develop a rhythm. You no longer flinch when the press handle jerks. You mix ink by feel, not measure. You even catch typos before the master does. He notices, offers you a small commission. A local merchant wants a printed prayer for his dying mother. Just 30 copies. Small run. But yours to manage. You typeset carefully. Center each line. Double check the spacing. When the batch is complete, the merchant thanks you with a loaf of honeyed bread, your first solo job. It's modest, but it feels like victory. And yet, late that night, as you clean the press and rub the ink from your palms, you glance at a shelf full of printed works and feel the weight of it all. So many voices captured in these pages. So many secrets. So many risks. You wonder how many of these words will survive. How many will be read a century from now? And how many will be burned, forgotten, or banned? But that's not your concern now. Your job is to keep printing, keep the rollers clean, keep the ink flowing. Because here in Florence, ink stains more than just the page. It stains history. It stains power. And if you're lucky, it stains just enough of your name into the margin to be remembered. Chapter 7. Discovery beneath the frescoes. The thing about frescoes is they don't just decorate walls, they become them. The pigment binds directly to wet plaster, soaking into the surface until paint and structure are one. It's permanent, or at least as permanent as anything can be in a city like Florence, where buildings shift and stories are layered atop each other like coats of lime wash. And sometimes, just sometimes, those stories whisper back, if you know where to look. Centuries later, restorers would stand on scaffolds under crumbling chapels and peel back layers of paint, revealing hidden lines, forgotten saints, and occasionally something far stranger, a face, faintly sketched where it didn't belong. A Latin word that made no theological sense. A tiny hand gesture concealed in the fold of a robe. You begin to realize that the Renaissance wasn't just about celebrating beauty. It was also about hiding things, messages, warnings, maybe even revenge. Fresco work was demanding, not just in effort, but in timing. Each section had to be completed before the plaster dried, which meant artists worked in narrow strips called giornate, literally days' work. You couldn't paint the whole wall at once. Just a section each day. Mistakes couldn't be wiped off. They had to be chipped away, replastered, and started again. And if you were just an assistant or apprentice, you weren't painting angels or prophets. You were preparing pigment, mixing lime, or tracing the master's cartoon onto the wall. Cartoons weren't funny. They were full-scale drawings used as blueprints for the final work. Some were pounced pricked with holes and dusted with charcoal to transfer the design. Others were incised, scratched into the plaster like ghost lines for the brush to follow. These cartoons were rarely saved. They were tools, not treasures. But once in a while, a bored apprentice, or a bitter one, would leave a mark. A tiny figure, a word, a symbol that didn't belong. Something no one would notice once the fresco was finished. Unless, of course, the fresco faded or was damaged. Or centuries later, someone came along with a scalpel and too much curiosity. In Santa Croce, there's a chapel where a restorer once uncovered a second pair of eyes beneath a painted Madonna. They weren't aligned. One set looked forward, the other slightly to the left, almost as if glancing toward a doorway. No records mention why. Maybe the artist changed his mind. Or maybe someone was watching. There are other stories, passed down quietly in studios. An artist who painted a bishop's likeness into the face of Judas. Another who hid the initials of his dead lover in the hem of a saint's robe. One fresco, long since destroyed, was said to include the master's rival depicted as a donkey among sheep. The joke went unnoticed for 20 years until a certain Medici family members saw the resemblance. But even the sanctioned images carried messages. Florence was a city steeped in symbolism. Every hand gesture had meaning. Every flower, every bird. A laurel wreath wasn't just decoration, it signaled triumph or a connection to poetry. A pomegranate in the hand of a child meant resurrection. A broken column could mean lost virtue or a fallen city. Artists used this coded language to add layers to their work, often in ways that only the most educated viewers would catch. Sometimes, not even the patron understood. They'd nod in approval at a composition, unaware they were being subtly critiqued within it. And then there were the faces. Oh, the faces. Artists used the people around them. That market girl with the tilted chin. She became an angel. The tired old man from the wine shop. St. Jerome. Sometimes even the dead were revived in pigment. A brother lost to plague. A mother remembered through the eyes of the Virgin. But just as often, enemies were immortalized. Not as heroes, as heretics, demons, cowards, or fools. An artist's revenge didn't shout. It smiled, quietly, from the wall of a sacred space. The church tried to regulate these practices. There were rules about iconography, proportions, even the order of colors in certain robes. But the artist knew how to work around them. You'd paint the angel's wing just wide enough to cover the offending symbol. You'd place a scroll across a scandalous name. You'd paint truth under the lie, and trust that time, dust, or some future curious soul would uncover it again. Some frescoes were never finished, and those tell the most interesting stories. An unfinished figure. An unpainted hand reaching for something that was never added. You can almost feel the moment the scaffolding was abandoned. Maybe the money ran out. Maybe the master died. Maybe the building was repurposed and no one bothered to complete the scene. These ghost paintings became part of Florence's living architecture. No one removes them. They just build around them, as if acknowledging that the city itself is always mid-sentence. You start to understand why some artists painted so obsessively. It wasn't just ambition, it was survival. In a city where death came swiftly from disease, betrayal, or poverty, painting on a wall was a kind of permanence, a way to outlast your body, to sneak your name, your thoughts, your protest into a chapel where it would be seen by hundreds, maybe thousands, even if no one ever knew it was yours. But that permanence came with risk. If the church didn't approve, they could have your fresco plastered over, erased. Not just your art, your voice. One artist, Fra Bernardo, was ordered to revise his last judgment after the bishop deemed it excessively muscular. Another had his entire chapel whitewashed because a patron changed political allegiances and didn't want to be associated with the opposing faction saints. The wall doesn't care. It accepts pigment or plaster with equal ease. Still, the secrets persisted. Tucked beneath layers, waiting, you think of the artists who painted with trembling hands, knowing they were breaking rules, but doing it anyway, not loudly. Just enough to breathe something real into the saint's frozen eyes. Because in Florence, a wall isn't just a wall. It's a mirror, a canvas, a whisper that can last centuries if no one listens too closely. You wouldn't expect a city obsessed with precision and protocol to harbor so many secrets in its walls. But the deeper you look, the more you find. Restoration work in Florence is a bit like archaeology with a paintbrush. You peel away layers with scalpel and sponge, revealing not just old pigment, but older intentions, later identified as an instrument from North Africa. Why is it there? Who is he? An early cipher. Decades later, a codebreaker suggests it spells the artist's name embedded in polished steel, completely invisible unless lit from just the right angle. Not pride, not exactly. More like a dare. Find me if you can. Bishops weren't trained to see subtext. They looked for heresy in sermons, not paint, and the patrons, especially the ones who mixed the pigment and traced the outlines. You could tell when a figure had been changed, when a hand originally pointed one direction, then was redrawn, when a saint's expression softened too much. One apprentice in a large Florentine studio began keeping his own notebook, a secret one documenting the things he noticed. One studio was asked to depict the martyrdom of a local saint. The painter refused to show the blood. Instead, he painted the moment before, filled with stillness, the saint looking directly at the viewer. Edited, rewritten, annotated with meaning only visible in certain light. The city's memory isn't just in books, it's in pigments. And if you had the tools, the patience, and the nerve, you might just read something no one else was meant to see. Some said he was being reverent. Others whispered he feared censorship, but most believe it was a protest. A refusal to glorify suffering just to please the church. It didn't matter. The bishop demanded it be redone. The studio complied. But because once you see behind the fresco, once you learn what the artist truly whispered into plaster, you can never quite look at a blank wall the same way again. But behind the final image, on the original layer, the bloodless saint still waits. Peaceful, silent, extra symbols, small alterations, eyes painted with double irises. In the Cathedral of Fiesole, a thunderstorm once loosened the plaster in a corner chapel. Underneath, restorers found a half-finished fresco. A hunting scene? Horses, dogs, a nobleman with a hawk on his wrist. Nothing religious, possibly a patron's private indulgence. For whatever reason, it had been covered over with a more appropriate biblical scene. And yet, the paint beneath was still vivid, like it had been waiting. Years later, after the workshop disbanded, he vanished. No one knows what happened to him. Some say he fled after seeing too much. Others believe he was recruited by a secret group of artists dedicated to preserving these hidden messages. The truth is no one knows, but the notebook, it survived. Discovered in a cracked drawer under an altar. Centuries later, half the pages had been eaten by worms. The rest were just legible enough to cause debate in 3 universities. Most just wanted their family crest painted into a corner. Maybe a likeness or 2 of their children disguised as cherubs. A flattering Virgin Mary and a proper-looking Joseph, and they'd sign the final payment. Few ever studied the backgrounds closely. A visitor? A lost friend? A lover immortalized behind a donkey in a manger? You'd look at the central figure, Christ, a saint, a martyr, and miss the tiny dog chewing a human bone in the corner. The Basilica of San Lorenzo has a faded fresco of St. Peter holding a scroll. But you, having seen the way artists worked, know better. Nothing in a Renaissance fresco is an accident. Every placement, every shadow, every tilt of the head carries weight. Especially the things no one was meant to notice. The scroll's text has changed over time. Not physically, but in interpretation. For decades it was thought to be a simple scripture verse. Then a scholar realized the phrase resembled a line from a banned philosophical treatise. The scroll was repainted, twice, but the original outline always bled through eventually, as if the wall itself had memory. They eventually sealed it under a bronze frame, hoping the mystery would be forgotten. It wasn't. Missed the merchant's face sketched into a Roman soldier. Missed the beggar whose hands bear the same wounds as the crucified. These weren't accidents. They were editorial choices, quiet critiques, satire that could only be whispered with brushes. The patron never noticed. No one did until long after the artist had turned to dust. One layer tells the official story. The one beneath tells the one hoped no one would ever find. And if you're lucky or perhaps unlucky, you stumble on a moment of truth captured in lime and pigment, hidden for centuries behind plaster and prayer. There's the chapel in the convent of Sant'Ambrogio, where a restorer once uncovered a small Latin phrase behind a saint's halo. Faint, faded, but unmistakable. It read Ubi dolor, ibi veritas. Where there is pain, there is truth. No record indicates why it was placed there. It wasn't part of the original commission. Some think it was the work of a grieving assistant adding a private prayer. Others believe it was a protest, a comment on the violence behind the holiness. It doesn't matter now. It was painted over during the next restoration. Sometimes it's not text but figures. A musician in the background of a nativity scene, holding a strange lute not found in any local tradition. And there's the famous fresco in the Palazzo della Signoria, where a soldier's armor glints with what, upon inspection, are tiny mirrored letters. Back then, most people thought of frescoes the way we think of wallpaper, decorative, sacred, static. But the artists knew otherwise. They were building narrative traps. The church didn't approve, but it rarely noticed. But apprentices did. Then there are the cases where the art simply refuses to fade. Modern experts often wonder whether these messages were truly intentional or just the product of coincidence and time. And it wasn't just what they painted, it was what they refused to. There are even entire scenes hidden beneath unrelated ones. You realize over time that the walls of Florence are not just stone and lime. They're manuscripts, but it comes at a cost. Not every secret is welcome. Not every truth wants to be remembered, and maybe that's why you wouldn't last. Not because you lack the talent. Chapter 8. Architectural Dreams and Nightmares. Florence's towering ambitions and crumbling projects. You don't fully understand Florence until you look up. The city is a forest of towers, domes, and arches, each straining for the sky, each carrying the weight of ambition and ego baked into sun-dried brick. From the streets, it's easy to be dazzled. The Duomo soars above the rooftops like a crown forged from terracotta and genius. Facades gleam with polished marble, and columns rise like petrified trees. But climb the scaffolding, peek behind the stone, and you'll see something else. Wood frames held together with fraying ropes, laborers coughing from lime dust, designs that were altered mid-project because someone ran out of money or patience. This is the part of Florence most people don't write poems about. The part where architectural glory was often built atop back-breaking labor, improvisation, and just a touch of panic. You find yourself apprenticed to a workshop attached to one of the city's great building sites. Not a painter's studio or sculptor's shed, but a carpenter's yard that smells of pine resin and damp rope. The master here is not an artist, but an architect engineer. A man who mutters about stress loads in his sleep and measures everything twice. Except when he's in a hurry, you admire him because he talks about the sky like it's a rival. His dream is not just to build structures, but to outlast gravity. You quickly learn that architecture in Florence is not neat geometry. It's survival math. Every stone must be lifted, weighed, angled. Pulleys creak with the strain of hoisting massive blocks. Wooden cranes, designed by clever minds and powered by human treadmills, groan as they spin. Men in sandals walk inside giant wooden wheels, like human hamsters, just to raise beams into place. Some faint from heat, some fall. The work continues. Nothing is ever flat, not the streets, not the walls, not the plans. Drawings are made on parchment, isn't stone. Measurements shift. Angles wobble. And then there's the weather-blistering sun, sudden rains, and the ever-present dust that coats every surface and sticks to your sweat like a second skin. You start small, sanding timber, coating beams with sealant, holding ropes, but you're ambitious. One afternoon, you ask to help with the dome supports. The master hands you a broom and tells you to sweep the scaffolding. It's not the answer you hoped for, but you climb anyway. Up narrow wooden ladders that sway as you move, past bricklayers shouting in dialects you barely understand, until you stand beneath the ribs of an unfinished dome. It's massive, unreal, like standing inside a cracked eggshell designed by gods and built by mortals on borrowed time. Above you, workers hammer brick in a herringbone pattern, an innovation meant to distribute weight. One slip and it all collapses. That knowledge keeps your back pressed tightly to the support beam. You sweep carefully, silently, then you descend. Your legs shaking from more than just height. The master nods at your return, but says nothing. Later, you find out he watched the whole thing. Bravery is good, he tells you, but next time, tie your tunic tighter. No one wants to see a death with his belt undone. There's humor in the trade, arc humor, because danger is constant. You hear stories from other sites' walls that buckled, staircases that collapsed mid-installation, domes that cracked from poor alignment, and always the blame passes like a hot stone. Was it the mason? The designer? The laborer who took a shortcut? No one wants to be the one whose name ends up in the city's records next to the word failure. But the dream drives them forward. Every architect in Florence wants to be remembered, not for their signature, for their silhouette, the shape they leave against the sky. One master spends years designing a church facade, only to have the project halted halfway through by a new patron who prefers something less Gothic. The master dies before construction resumes. The next architect erases his work. No credit, no stone. You wonder if all of it is worth it. The sleepless nights, the endless measurements, the stomach-turning heights. But then you see the light at sunset hitting a newly finished archway, casting shadows that ripple like water across the wall. And for a moment, you forget the scaffolding and the sweat. You see the shape, and it's beautiful. Florence's buildings are riddled with compromises. The cathedral's nave doesn't quite match the dome. One side of a bell tower is steeper than the other. Some doors open into nothing because the adjoining wing was never built. But no one speaks of these faults. They're part of the myth. The great lie that Florence was always perfect, that every column was planned, every curve intentional. You see young architects sketching in the piazza, tracing buildings with hopeful eyes. They don't see the patchwork repairs, the cracks sealed with spit and hope. They see only the triumph. And maybe that's the point. Architecture here isn't just about function or beauty. It's about legacy. You build not because you think it will last, but because someone might believe it did. The master tells you one night over shared bread and weak wine that his first building collapsed after 3 months. He went home and cried into his tools, but then he got up, designed another, built again. Architecture, he says, is failing upward. You don't fully understand what he means. Not yet. But when the next project begins, a new civic hall with strange curves and untested materials, you volunteer. Not because you're ready, but because something about lifting stone into the air and daring it to stay there makes you feel like you matter. And in Florence, that's all anyone ever wanted. To matter, even if the roof caves in 10 years later. There's a saying whispered around Florence's building yards: the higher the tower, the longer the shadow. It's meant literally tall structures cast darkness on nearby homes, but it means something else, too. Ambition brings risk. The taller your dream, the harder the fall when it crumbles. And here, in this city of saints and schemers, every block of stone laid on another is a gamble. You see it everywhere. Half-finished wings of monasteries, facades that end abruptly in jagged brick, staircases that climb up 3 stories, then stop at open air. They're the ghosts of budget cuts, political shifts, patron deaths. A grand design starts with trumpets and ribbon cuttings, but then the sponsor dies or flees or is accused of heresy. And suddenly the building just ... pauses. Some pause for a season. Some for centuries. The cathedral's dome, Santa Maria del Fiore, is the symbol of Florentine innovation, but even it was born from panic. The base was completed long before the dome design existed. They simply built it and hoped someone clever would come along with a solution. That someone was Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith with no formal architectural training. He proposed not scaffolding, not flying buttresses, but a layered herringbone brick pattern held together with ribs and faith. No one believed it would work, and yet it stands casting its red-orange glow across the city, even now. But what people forget is what it cost. Not just in money or materials, but in labor. The workers had to haul bricks up narrow spiral staircases, carry mortar by hand, and balance on wooden beams while pigeons nested in their hair. Some days, the sun turned the dome's interior into an oven. Other days, the wind howled through the open ribs, threatening to push you right off the edge. One misstep, and you weren't injured. You were gone, and there were always missteps. The records don't say how many, but the local graveyards near the Arno filled faster during major construction seasons. In your own work, the dangers are less dramatic, but no less real. On a recent job reinforcing a palazzo foundation, you spent 3 days in a trench so narrow you can barely turn. The air is thick with mildew, and rats skitter along the stone like they own it. You wedge bricks into place, kneel in filthy water, and try not to think about the tonnage of building above you. You've learned to trust old stone, but you also know it doesn't take much, a cracked support, a shifting beam for it to collapse. Still, it's not always grim. There are moments when the city feels like it's unfolding in your hands. When a column aligns perfectly with a rising stairwell, when the morning light hits a coffered ceiling and reveals the geometry you designed months ago. Those are the moments you live for. The ones that make your back pain feel noble. You also learn the delicate art of architectural politics. That's an entire education by itself. There are the builders, the sponsors, the church officials, the city inspectors, the guild representatives, and the artists who insist on their vision. Keeping them all happy is impossible. So you learn who can be delayed, who can be bribed with wine, and who must be addressed as Your Magnificence, even if he once tripped over a dog in front of the scaffolding. One sponsor wants a loggia with rounded arches. The other insists on Gothic points. You suggest a hybrid, and they both hate it. So you quietly build it rounded, but carve the arch keystones to resemble sharp angles. Everyone is mildly annoyed, but agrees it looks fashionably unusual. You survive another week. Then there's the earthquake. Not a major one, but enough to shake the city awake at dawn. Cracks appear in the northern wall of a noble family's villa. You're summoned, told to explain why a modern design gave way. You inspect the site, find the problem. It wasn't your structure. It was the ancient sewer line underneath. eroded from years of runoff and ignored drainage. You explain this calmly. The nobleman stares at you like you just blamed his grandmother. You fixed the wall anyway. The payment arrives 2 weeks late, minus a deduction for professional unpleasantness. Still, the work continues. Because in Florence, buildings are never finished. They're edited, rearranged, reinvented. A palace wing becomes a school. A bell tower becomes a prison. A cloister garden becomes a dining hall. The buildings evolve like the people inside them, and somehow they hold together. You begin to see the city differently, not as a skyline, but as a puzzle. Every addition has a story. That lopsided roof. Built when taxes were charged based on street-facing height, so they expanded sideways instead. That odd courtyard shape. The result of 3 families fighting over a shared well. Every asymmetry, every awkward joint is evidence of negotiation, compromise, survival. And as you walk through the alleys after dusk, past buildings both majestic and awkward, you realize the truth. Florence isn't beautiful because it's perfect. It's beautiful because it's trying to rise above its limits, trying to impress the heavens, trying not to fall apart at the seams. You stop in front of a newly finished arch you helped design. It's not grand, it's not famous, but it's yours. The curve is smooth, the joints clean. And when someone walks beneath it and doesn't notice, that's the highest compliment. Because in architecture, invisibility often means success. No complaints, no collapses, just form and function doing their quiet dance. And you, covered in dust, ink on your fingers from last-minute revisions, smile, because you're not a painter or a poet. You build things that hold up roofs and cradle stairwells. You may never be remembered, but your work just might. Until the next earthquake. At least. Chapter 9. Dining with a Medici Patron. It begins with an invitation handwritten, sealed with wax, and delivered with an unsettling amount of ceremony for what is, in truth, a dinner. But in Florence, especially when the name Medici is involved, nothing is ever just dinner. It's theater. Diplomacy. A performance of taste and power. And if you're invited, it means 2 things. Someone has noticed your work, and someone else expects you to behave. You've spent your career hunched over panels, hauling wood, sketching faces by candlelight, and suddenly you're standing in a courtyard draped with silk banners, pretending your boots aren't worn thin. The villa is enormous, but not ostentatious. Florentine wealth rarely shouts. Instead, it hums. Marble floors, carved lintels, frescoes in the dining chamber that would make your master weep with envy. You're offered wine before you even sat down, and a servant with impossibly clean hands whispers, red or white, as though the wrong answer might get you escorted out. You choose white, because red stains. The Medici host arrives last, of course. Not late, just perfectly timed. A man in his 40s, draped in a velvet tunic, the kind of smile that seems generous and calculating at once. He greets everyone by name, even you, which is impressive and vaguely terrifying. He says, the one who painted that charming Saint Sebastian for the Santa Lucia chapel. You nod, try to look humble, try not to choke on the almond pastry you're suddenly regretting. The table is long. The guests are a strange mix, a poet, a banker, a visiting architect from Milan, 2 ladies of uncertain title, and a young man with ink stains on his cuffs who might be the patron's nephew or might be a spy for the bishop. Conversations swirl about art, about trade, about Rome's latest scandal. You're expected to contribute just enough to seem intelligent, but not enough to sound arrogant. It's a test, and everyone knows it. The food arrives in courses, nothing you'd eat in a studio. Stuffed quails, honey-roasted pears, figs cut so precisely they look like they were chiseled. The servants move in synchronized silence, and you quickly learn not to reach for anything first. You follow the lead of the man across from you, who eats with one hand and flatters with the other. At one point, the Medici turns to you. Tell me, he says, what is the greatest challenge of your work? The table quiets. Every fork pauses. You answer as diplomatically as you can. capturing the soul without offending the church. He chuckles. Others nod. Someone mutters, "Well said." You exhale. You pass the first trial. Later, you're ushered into a smaller room, a kind of salon where books are displayed as trophies and a lute player plucks background ambience. The Medici offers you a glass of something stronger, asks if you've ever considered working on a larger scale. Perhaps a mural, perhaps for a library, perhaps for a cousin's tomb. Each suggestion is bait, and you're expected to bite, but not too eagerly. Too much enthusiasm reeks of desperation. Too little, and they'll give the job to someone flashier. Eventually, the Medici waves a hand and says, "We shall speak more soon," which means nothing, or everything. As you leave, you realize you've been at the villa for 4 hours and said less than a page of dialogue, but every word mattered. Every glance was weighed. You've survived a Medici dinner, which is to say, you've stepped closer to the sun. You're not burned yet. Back in your studio, everything smells like varnish and sweat again. It's grounding. You peel off the good tunic, fold it carefully, and return to your easel. A half-finished Madonna stares back at you, her hand still just an outline. You hesitate before lifting the brush, because now there's pressure, real pressure. A patron with power means visibility, and visibility means judgment. If they commission you and you fail, the whole city will know. One cracked pigment, one smudged face, and you're no longer the charming young artist with potential. You're the one who wasted the Medici's time. You think of the other artists who once attended dinners like that. Some rose, some vanished. You wonder what became of the one whose portrait was removed from the salon wall. No one talks about him now. You suspect that's intentional. So you paint carefully, thoughtfully, knowing that in Florence, your brush is not just a tool. It's a statement, a risk, a promise. And if you're lucky, your next invitation won't be to dine. It will be to decorate the ceiling. You thought the invitation was the reward. That being noticed by a Medici, being welcomed to the table, meant you'd cross some invisible threshold into the upper world. But what you didn't realize is that dinner isn't the end of the test. It's the beginning. In Florence, once the wine is poured and your name is spoken aloud by someone with enough florins to fund a chapel, the real work begins. It starts subtly. The Medici's steward appears at your workshop with a gift of walnut oil and a bundle of fine linen canvas. No message, just a nod. 2 days later, you receive a commission small but personal. A devotional panel for a niece. Modest pay. But the client is important. You paint it beautifully. Deliver it on time. The payment arrives late. You don't complain. Then comes the request for a design sketch. For a mural in the Medici summer home, nothing guaranteed. Just a concept. You stay up 3 nights drafting. When you deliver it, the household steward compliments your use of space, but wonders aloud if the face of the saint could look more wrung on. You redo it, then never hear back. A month passes. Another note arrives, this time from the Medici's cousin, asking if you'd consider overseeing a fresco in a new dining hall. Lower budget, higher pressure, you accept. The wall is uneven, the lighting terrible, the scaffolding rickety, but you complete it. It's decent work, not your best. The cousin is pleased enough to not criticize it publicly. Still, you haven't heard from the main patron again. You begin to wonder, did you say something wrong at the dinner? Were you too eager? Too reserved? Did you forget to address someone with the proper title? In Florence, the line between opportunity and exile is thinner than the edge of a gold leaf. You ask discreetly. An older artist, once highly favored by the same family, tells you not to worry. They test everyone, he says. If they still know your name, you're ahead of most. Eventually another note comes. A more formal commission this time. A portrait, high profile, an engagement gift for a young noblewoman. You're to paint her in soft tones with subtle references to fertility and wisdom. She's quiet during the sittings. Nervous, but polite. You learn she's being married off to someone she's never met. Her eyes carry that knowledge. You do your best to soften the truth in her expression, but not erase it. When the painting is unveiled, the family applauds your realism. She looks like she understands her duty, one aunt says. You're paid promptly, with a bonus. Later, the Medici himself passes you in the cathedral. He pauses, nods, and says, very fine work, then continues walking. That's it. That's the reward. A nod. A sentence. But in Florence, it's everything. Because now the city knows, the merchants mention your name, the priests stop criticizing your stylistic flourishes. You're invited to judge a student competition. An architect asks you to consult on fresco placement. Your master, who once mocked your short brushstrokes, now sends his newest apprentices to you for advice. You are, by every standard that matters, a success. But success in Florence comes with strings. The Medici patronage is not a safety net. It's a leash, polite, silken, decorated with praise, but a leash nonetheless. You're expected to speak carefully, to flatter the right people, to avoid scandal. Your next commission isn't offered, it's assigned. A depiction of Judith and Holofernes, a political allegory. You're told what symbolism to include. You do it because you have to. The city loves your new work, but you can't quite remember how it started, whether it was your idea or someone else's. You begin to understand why some artists fled. Not for safety, but for silence, to paint on their own terms. But you also understand why most stayed, because in Florence, favor is everything. It feeds your studio, protects your family, preserves your name. And so you play the game, you attend more dinners, you master the art of speaking without saying anything. You compliment the tapestries, even when they're clearly fading. You praise the roast, even when it's dry. You pretend not to notice when a rival is snubbed at the table. One night, at another gathering, you're seated beside a sculptor who once accused you of stealing a commission. He clinks his goblet against yours and says, "It's a good thing we're all friends now." You smile, say nothing. Because in Florence, friends are just rivals who haven't betrayed you yet. You walk home that night alone, past shuttered shops and stone archways. The wind smells of lavender and dust. You pass the chapel where your first painting still hangs. It's small, cracked now, faded from candle smoke. No one looks at it. But you do. And you remember that first commission, the one with no politics, no pressure, just the thrill of being paid to create. You remember how it felt to work for yourself, for the image in your mind, not the one whispered by a nobleman behind a goblet. You won't go back. Not really, not now. But the memory lingers. Because in Florence, you don't own your success. You rent it, one dinner at a time. Chapter 10, Plague in the Piazza. It doesn't arrive all at once. The plague never does. It drifts in like a rumor, slow, unsettling, whispered between market stalls and bakeries, passed in half sentences and side glances. A merchant in Pisa sickens and dies. A traveler from Genoa collapses near the city gate. Then someone's cousin, someone's apprentice, someone's midwife. At first, you try not to think about it. Florence has seen plague before. There are always outbreaks, always funerals. But this one feels heavier, thicker in the air, like it's pressing itself into the stones. Soon the bells begin, first in distant parishes, then closer, then constant. You've been painting a crucifixion scene. The commission was simple enough, a private altar piece, the sort of job that pays rent and keeps the workshop warm. But now the patron has stopped visiting. The carpenter hasn't delivered the new panel. Half your assistants are gone, some to the countryside, some to nowhere in particular. The streets are quieter. Not empty, but different. Florentines speak less. They walk faster. No one touches. The baker has started wrapping bread in cloth before handing it over. You do the same with coins? By the end of the week, mass burials have begun outside the city walls. In your neighborhood, a cloth is nailed to a door. Red. You know what that means. Someone inside is ill. The family quarantine. No one goes in. No one comes out. The silence behind the shutters is louder than any scream. Still, you paint. Because what else can you do? You try to finish the crucifixion, but your brush hesitates. You stare at Christ's face and realize it looks too clean, too noble, so you redo it. Add strain to the eyes. Sallow to the skin. The client may never see it, but it feels more honest. Then your neighbor, an elderly sculptor with crooked hands and a fondness for bitter wine, falls ill. You hear the coughing through the walls. You consider visiting. Then you don't. The next day he's gone. His apprentices seal the studio. They work silently, wearing silk cloths over their faces. You don't ask where the body went. The churches stay open longer than expected. Faith is, after all, the best weapon most have. But soon even the priests begin to vanish. One sermon ends with a cough. By the next morning, the chapel doors are locked. A note tacked outside reads, "Pray from home." And suddenly, everyone becomes religious. There are processions in the street, flagellants marching barefoot, chanting, striking their backs with cords. They sing in unison, the sound eerie, mournful, and strangely soothing. A merchant collapses mid-procession. No one breaks formation. They step over him. Keep walking. Art changes too. Commissions shift. The Medici halt their decorative frescoes and begin requesting altars with saints. Known for healing, Sebastian, Rock, Catherine. Painters stop romanticizing martyrdom and begin showing bodies writhing in agony. You see a panel in a rival's studio where death itself is painted, not as a figure, but as a dark fog creeping along the edges of the scene. It's haunting. It's true. There are fewer patrons now. Many have fled. Those who remain are cautious, less interested in aesthetics and more concerned with eternity. Can you paint a scene of the final judgment? One asks you, unblinking. Something hopeful, but not too hopeful. You try, but your angels look tired. You leave them that way. In your own home, the air feels different. You leave the windows open, hoping the breeze keeps illness away. You burn herbs, lavender, rosemary, a trick you learned from a herbalist who used to live near San Lorenzo. She vanished last month. No one knows how or when. You dream differently now, sometimes of funerals, sometimes of hands reaching for help, sometimes of strange, empty cities with painted walls but no people. You wake up sweating, then go to the window and breathe in the sour scent of smoke and wet stone. But even amid fear, Florence continues. Markets remain open, though fewer stalls are filled. Children still play, cautiously. Artists still paint. You pass a workshop where a young man is sketching saints on a panel of reclaimed wood. He glances at you, nods, then returns to work. The nod says everything. We keep going. You begin a new piece, uncommissioned. A Madonna with no child. Just her staring out from the panel, her eyes rimmed with red. Not crying, just watching. You don't know why you're painting her. You don't know who will want it. But it feels necessary. Later, someone tells you the Medici chapel has been sealed. Not because of death, but out of fear. Rumors say a visitor from Naples brought the illness inside. Others say it was a priest or a guard, or a servant who lit too many candles and fainted from the heat. No one knows. But no one enters now. Not even the Medici. As summer approaches, the deaths slow. Not stop, but slow. The bells still ring, but less often. The claws on the doors come down, quietly, as if ashamed. You walk through the streets one morning and hear a lute being played. The sound is hesitant, almost apologetic. But beautiful? You return to the Madonna, add a slight curve to her mouth. Not a smile. Something gentler, like remembering how to breathe. And for the first time in months, you paint without fear in your chest, because even in plague, Florence endures, not untouched, but unbowed. And so do you. Chapter 10, Plague in the Piazza. It doesn't arrive all at once. The plague never does. It drifts in like a rumor, slow, unsettling, whispered between market stalls and bakeries, passed in half sentences and side glances. A merchant in Pisa sickens and dies. A traveler from Genoa collapses near the city gate. Then someone's cousin, someone's apprentice, someone's midwife. At first, you try not to think about it. Florence has seen plague before. There are always outbreaks, always funerals, but this one feels heavier, thicker in the air, like it's pressing itself into the stones. Soon the bells begin, first in distant parishes, then closer, then constant. You've been painting a crucifixion scene. The commission was simple enough, a private altar piece, the sort of job that pays rent and keeps the workshop warm. But now the patron has stopped visiting. The carpenter hasn't delivered the new panel. Half your assistants are gone, some to the countryside, some to nowhere in particular. The streets are quieter. Not empty, but different. Florentines speak less. They walk faster. No one touches. The baker has started wrapping bread in cloth before handing it over. You do the same with coins? By the end of the week, mass burials have begun outside the city walls. In your neighborhood, a cloth is nailed to a door. Red. You know what that means. Someone inside is ill. The family quarantine. No one goes in. No one comes out. The silence behind the shutters is louder than any scream. Still, you paint. Because what else can you do? You try to finish the crucifixion, but your brush hesitates. You stare at Christ's face and realize it looks too clean, too noble, so you redo it. Add strain to the eyes. Sallow to the skin. The client may never see it, but it feels more honest. Then your neighbor, an elderly sculptor with crooked hands and a fondness for bitter wine, falls ill. You hear the coughing through the walls. You consider visiting. Then you don't. The next day he's gone. His apprentices seal the studio. They work silently, wearing silk cloths over their faces. You don't ask where the body went. The churches stay open longer than expected. Faith is, after all, the best weapon most have. But soon even the priests begin to vanish. One sermon ends with a cough. By the next morning, the chapel doors are locked. A note tacked outside reads, "Pray from home." And suddenly, everyone becomes religious. There are processions in the street, flagellants marching barefoot, chanting, striking their backs with cords. They sing in unison, the sound eerie, mournful, and strangely soothing. A merchant collapses mid-procession. No one breaks formation. They step over him. Keep walking. Art changes too. Commissions shift. The Medici halt their decorative frescoes and begin requesting altars with saints. Known for healing, Sebastian, Rock, Catherine. Painters stop romanticizing martyrdom and begin showing bodies writhing in agony. You see a panel in a rival's studio where death itself is painted, not as a figure, but as a dark fog creeping along the edges of the scene. It's haunting. It's true. There are fewer patrons now. Many have fled. Those who remain are cautious, less interested in aesthetics and more concerned with eternity. Can you paint a scene of the final judgment? One asks you, unblinking. Something hopeful, but not too hopeful. You try, but your angels look tired. You leave them that way. In your own home, the air feels different. You leave the windows open, hoping the breeze keeps illness away. You burn herbs, lavender, rosemary, a trick you learned from a herbalist who used to live near San Lorenzo. She vanished last month. No one knows how or when. You dream differently now, sometimes of funerals, sometimes of hands reaching for help, sometimes of strange, empty cities with painted walls but no people. You wake up sweating, then go to the window and breathe in the sour scent of smoke and wet stone. But even amid fear, Florence continues. Markets remain open, though fewer stalls are filled. Children still play, cautiously. Artists still paint. You pass a workshop where a young man is sketching saints on a panel of reclaimed wood. He glances at you, nods, then returns to work. The nod says everything. We keep going. You begin a new piece, uncommissioned. A Madonna with no child. Just her staring out from the panel, her eyes rimmed with red. Not crying, just watching. You don't know why you're painting her. You don't know who will want it. But it feels necessary. Later, someone tells you the Medici chapel has been sealed. Not because of death, but out of fear. Rumors say a visitor from Naples brought the illness inside. Others say it was a priest or a guard, or a servant who lit too many candles and fainted from the heat. No one knows. But no one enters now. Not even the Medici. As summer approaches, the deaths slow. Not stop, but slow. The bells still ring, but less often. The claws on the doors come down, quietly, as if ashamed. You walk through the streets one morning and hear a lute being played. The sound is hesitant, almost apologetic. But beautiful? You return to the Madonna, add a slight curve to her mouth. Not a smile. Something gentler, like remembering how to breathe. And for the first time in months, you paint without fear in your chest, because even in plague, Florence endures, not untouched, but unbowed. And so do you. The months after a plague are unlike any others. They carry a strange silence, a muted kind of life. Not joy exactly, but something softer than grief. You feel it when walking to the square, how footsteps echo more now, how pigeons flutter and settle with less urgency, how shopkeepers speak to each other in low tones as though the air still listens for sorrow. Florence is a city that refuses to stop, and yet you can tell something in it, cracked. Buildings that once boomed with laughter now seem to lean inward, protective. Even the fountains seem slower, as if the marble itself needs rest. The artists are back in their studios, but their styles have shifted. The romantic scenes of Bacchus and dancing putti are out. In their place, saints, suffering, and salvation. Everyone's brush seems heavier now, like the weight of the city is carried in every stroke. You begin to notice odd details. A previously arrogant painter is suddenly kind, offering his apprentices extra bread at midday. A young noblewoman, once obsessed with fashion, now wears the same dress each week, washed and plain. At first, you think it's poverty, but then you realize it's mourning. A brother, a cousin, someone gone. A sculptor, stops taking commissions altogether. He begins carving tiny votive figures instead, dozens of them. Small, nearly featureless saints. He lines them up along the windowsill of his studio, facing outward. When you ask why, he says he wants the city to know someone's still praying. Then, strangely, art begins to sell again. Not the elaborate, expensive sort, but small devotional panels, icons, and protective charms. People want symbols now. Proof that someone, somewhere, is still watching over them. You find yourself painting more Madonnas than ever before. Not grand throne-seated ones, but simple portraits, human, tired, kind. They sell quickly, quietly, often for less than their worth. But you accept the coin and the thanks. One day, you're invited to repaint a chapel wall that had been stained during a rushed burial. The client, an elderly widow, asks for a fresco of the Last Supper. But instead of the traditional poses, she requests the figures look lonely. They know it's coming, she says. Let them show it. You paint it carefully, and when you unveil it, she cries. Not loudly, just one tear. She kisses your hand and says nothing else. That night, you stay in your studio long after the lamps burn low. You sit beside your easel and stare at an unfinished sketch of a cathedral. You began it before the plague, full of arches and people in movement. You study it now, and it feels foreign, too clean, too full. You begin reworking it, adding gaps, cracks, shadows in the corners. The arches remain, but the people are fewer, the movement slower. It feels truer. Then, for the first time in weeks, your old patron returns. The one from the dinner, the Medici. He enters your studio without a word, looks around, and stops in front of your Madonna. He doesn't ask to buy it. He simply says, Florence is changing. We must decide how we remember it. You don't know what he means? Not yet, but you nod. Because he's right, Florence is not the same city. It breathes differently now. The streets have reopened. The cafes serve wine again. But every laugh seems shorter, every song a little more cautious. The city survived, yes, but it's no longer innocent. That illusion is gone. You begin to notice how the architecture reflects this too. New buildings are simpler, less adorned. Even the nobles' homes use fewer statues, fewer friezes. It's not lack of money. It's restraint. Everyone has seen what excess cannot protect them from. The guilds adapt. The Painters Guild begins collecting a portion of dues to support families of lost artists. It's not enough, but it's something. And For the first time, there's open talk about allowing apprentices from lower-class families into certain workshops. Not everywhere, but it's a start. The city government holds a procession to mark the end of the worst. Not a celebration, more of a reckoning. The bells ring not in mourning, but in memory. You walk among the crowd. Faces familiar and unfamiliar. Hands folded, heads bowed. Some people hold candles. Others carry small tokens, rings, letters, dried flowers. You carry nothing and yet feel heavier than all of them. At the front of the procession is a new altar piece, painted by a once-unknown artist. It depicts Florence, not the real city, but a city made of light and fog, with angels perched on rooftops and saints hidden in alleyways. People weep when they see it, not because it's accurate, but because it's hopeful. You don't know what comes next, whether commissions will continue, whether the Medici will fund more chapels, whether patrons will still crave beauty or now only seek comfort. But you do know this, you survived. Your art, your hands, your breath, they remain. You can still create, still shape light and shadow into meaning. And in a city rebuilt on memory, that may be the most powerful thing of all. Later that week, you sit on the edge of the Arno, sketching. Not for money, not for anyone, just sketching. A boat passes. Children shout across the water. The sun glints off a window. Life, somehow, is still happening. You close your notebook, stand, and walk home. Florence has changed. So have you. Chapter 11. The Women Behind the Canvas. You've walked past her a dozen times without really noticing. She's in a painting hanging in the vestibule of the Santa Croce Library. Standing behind a saint, her head bowed, hands folded. A secondary figure meant to fill the space. But once you finally really look, you see her, and she's not an afterthought. Her face is detailed, individual, almost out of place in the rigid symmetry of the scene. And suddenly, you begin to wonder, who is she? The official records won't tell you. Her name isn't mentioned in the commission notes. The contract only names the patron, the artist, and a sum of florins paid for 2 holy figures and attending persons. But she's not just attending. She's watching. Her expression isn't pious. It's alert, present. Someone knew her. Someone cared. In Florence, women are everywhere in art, but rarely on the page. They're Madonnas, martyrs, allegories of virtue. Always symbolic, rarely specific. The women who posed, who guided, who painted in secret, most of them have vanished from the ledgers. Not because they weren't there, but because no one bothered to record them, unless, of course, they were causing problems. Take the case of a young painter's wife in the parish of Santo Spirito. She assisted her husband for years mixing pigments, priming panels, even helping with underdrawings when the apprentices were ill. Some claim she had the better eye for composition, but her name never appeared on a single piece. When her husband died suddenly, she tried to finish his final commission, a small altarpiece of St. Agnes. The patron refused to pay, said it wasn't proper, said it didn't feel like the master's work. The irony was, she had done half of the master's work all along. After that, she disappeared from the record. Some say she joined a convent. Others say she continued painting under another artist's name. You begin to look closer now, at old works, at marginal figures. The more you study them, the more you recognize faces repeating across different paintings, different artists. A particular tilt of the chin, a narrow brow, the way the mouth rests in thoughtful calm. Not divine. Not imagined. Real. These women weren't invented. They were modeled. Again and again. One was said to be the daughter of a textile merchant, sharp, clever, fluent in Latin. She posed for nearly every artist in the Santa Maria Novella Quarter. One claimed she helped him design a tapestry border. Another said she wrote the verse accompanying his Annunciation. But none of them named her. Then there's the story of the nun painter from Fiesole. Her work was confined to the cloister walls, but those who saw it swore her saints had warmth. Real flesh, real sorrow. A traveling artist once tried to take credit for her work, but was dismissed after a bishop discovered the painter had been enclosed for 20 years. No one outside the convent had touched those brushes. The frescoes still exist, faded now, but vibrant in their composition. She signed none of them. Back in your own studio, you remember the wife of your old master? She used to sit in the corner, mending tunics, quietly correcting the apprentices when they mismeasured pigments. She never raised her voice, but when she spoke, everyone listened. Once you caught her sketching in a ledger, copying a Madonna with more grace than your master ever managed. You asked her why she didn't paint. She smiled and said, "Florence already has too many mouths to feed." You thought she meant the guild, but now you think she meant the truth. You start asking around. Carefully, a fellow artist admits his best model was also his muse, but no one could know. Clients don't want to think of women that way, he mutters. They want symbols, not people. You read a will tucked into the back of an archive volume where a minor painter left his brushes not to his sins, but to his sister. She kept my hand steady. It reads. That's all. No last name, no mention elsewhere. But it's something, and you begin to understand just how much has been hidden. Not out of malice, always. Sometimes out of habit, or expectation, or convenience. But the effect is the same. A city filled with women's faces, women's hands, women's voices, all erased behind the varnish. Not all the women behind the canvas were quiet, though. Some made noise, just enough to be remembered in fragments. One name you stumble across is Lucretia di Bartolomeo, a scribe's daughter who copied miniatures for a religious printer. Her style was fine, neat, full of graceful borders and inventive flourishes. The printer swore he did the work himself, but eventually, a client caught the signature tiny, hidden in the tail of a ribbon. LDB. He accused the printer of fraud. The books were burned. She vanished, but not before someone else copied her style and passed it off as his own for years. Even now, her touch lives on in secret, in corners. And then there's Isabetta, the embroiderer whose work adorned altar cloths across the city. She wasn't a painter, not formally. But when you examine her stitching, it's hard to deny her command of space and light. She told stories in silk and thread, entire parables in the hem of a coat. One bishop asked her to teach his decorators. She agreed briefly. Then one of the men took credit for her method, patented it with the guild, and pushed her out. Her work still hangs in the Duomo, but her name was never stitched into the folds. What's most haunting, though, are the rumors. Whispers passed from one artist's apprentice to another, from housemaid to painter's wife, that a nun in Siena once created a full passion cycle on wood panels using only leftover pigment scraps. That a girl disguised herself as a boy to train under a master for 3 years before being discovered and forced to marry. That an older widow who'd lost 3 sons to plague began painting votive icons by moonlight and leaving them anonymously in chapels. The priest, touched by their beauty, declared them miracles. He never knew her name. You start seeing signs everywhere. Paintings with slightly different brushwork on the underlayers. Records showing sudden stylistic shifts mid-project, always attributed to illness or travel. Contracts with strange gaps, entire sections scraped away. It feels like tracing shadows. They were there, and they were good. One evening, while helping restore a faded chapel mural, you find a monogram scratched into the plaster beneath a saint's halo. Not a full name, just a looping A. The mural is officially credited to a well-known workshop. But this detail feels different, delicate, personal. You show it to your mentor. He shrugs. Probably just a mark from the underlayer, he says. But you're not so sure. You start to wonder how many masterpieces were collaborations. How many Madonnas were painted not by one man, but by 2 hands, one public, one hidden. How many wives gently corrected their husbands' perspectives? How many sisters sketched the better version in the margin? How many daughters wiped brushes and gave ideas, only to be told, kindly and firmly, that art was not for them? The guilds didn't help, of course. Women were barred from official apprenticeship. Some exceptions were made, mostly for those born into families of artisans. But even then, the woman's role was limited and encouraged to help with workshop duties, but rarely credited. They could mix pigments, prepare panels, even teach the younger boys. But sign a painting? Not unless she married the right man or entered a convent with an unusually generous abbess. And yet, despite the barriers, some carved a place for themselves. Sophonisba Anguissola from Cremona would rise just a few decades later to paint courts and kings. But she would always be described as a marvel, an exception, a curiosity. Never just a painter. Never simply an artist. You think of all the unnamed women before her, those who taught themselves anatomy by candlelight, who painted on scraps of canvas, who painted for no one but themselves. It's easy to imagine them working in the quiet hours while their children slept or their husbands drank, creating not for fame, not for money, but for relief, for order, for beauty. One evening, you meet a weaver's widow who shows you a book of drawings passed down from her grandmother. The lines are faint, shaky in places, but they pulse with life botanical studies. Gestures of hands, sketches of eyes peering from behind cloth. She says the drawings were made in secret. She wasn't allowed, the woman says, with a dry smile. So she drew anyway? You close the book slowly, hands tingling. The weight of what has been lost is staggering. Not just the art, but the stories, the talent, the possibilities. You return to your studio and begin a new panel. Nothing grand, a portrait. A woman seated, hands resting on her lap. Her face is calm, not smiling, not sailing, just present. You don't name her. You don't explain her. You just let her be. And when it's done, you scratch a letter into the back of the panel. Not your initial, hers. Because if history forgot her once, maybe now it won't forget her again. Chapter 12. Alchemy, Astrology, and Art. In the Florentine workshop, art was never just about paint and brush. It was a study in chemistry, a meditation on the cosmos, and in its most mystical corners, a whispering dialogue with the unseen. The 15th century didn't divide knowledge the way we do today. Painting and potion making weren't so far apart. An artist, to be taken seriously, had to understand not just anatomy and proportion, but elements, metals, planetary movements, and sacred geometry. To be a master, you needed more than talent. You needed alchemy. You begin to see this when preparing ultramarine, the rich, luminous blue ground from lapis lazuli. The stone arrives in chunks from beyond Venice, wrapped in burlap and straw. It looks like nothing special, just jagged rock. But when broken open, it gleams. To extract the pigment is an ordeal. First, the stone is ground with honey and lye, kneaded like dough, then soaked in alcohol and carefully filtered. It takes weeks. The result is a powder so vibrant, so deep, it seems to glow from within. And it costs more than gold, quite literally. That's why the Virgin Mary's robes are always blue, because that color was a declaration of reverence and wealth. And you think that's where the magic ends? But then you're told not to mix it under a waning moon. It dulls the spirit, your mentor says. He's not joking. Astrology threads through everything. Before beginning a major work, artists consult almanacs. A favorable alignment of Venus and Jupiter might bring a gentle light to the final layer. A Mercury in retrograde? Better to delay? Some even place talismans under their panels, small carved charms or written prayers meant to protect the artwork or guide the hand. You laugh at this at first, but after ruining a canvas during a Mars-dominant week paint drying too quickly, the subject's eyes turning harsh, you start paying attention. In the pigment shop near the Ponte Vecchio, the seller speaks like an herbalist. He offers you vermilion and orpiment, both poisonous in their raw forms. Used wrongly, it burns, he warns, but handled properly, it sings. He's talking about color. You hope? Then there are the binder's egg yolk, rabbit skin glue, fig sap. Each has its own temperament. Egg tempers make for fast drying and sharp edges, but they sour if left out too long. The fig sap is tricky. It creates a sheen, but it must be mixed during high humidity. Recipes are guarded like family heirlooms. An artist might share his brush, but never his binder formula. And then the circles, not painted ones, etched. You've seen them scratched into the corners of wooden panels, invisible unless the light hits just right. Some are symbol sigils, perhaps. Others are pure geometry. The golden ratio, the pentagram. These aren't decorations. They're believed to align the artwork with divine order. One master you work under insisted every canvas be measured using chords stretched across in multiples of Fibonacci numbers. Nature obeys the pattern, he said. So should we. You believed it was eccentricity. Then you saw the harmony in his final work, the way it drew the eye and settled the mind. Not beautiful, balanced. Even subject matter bends to cosmic thinking. A painting of St. John might be scheduled for completion near the summer solstice, aligning the saint's birth with solar ascent, a last judgment scene, best begun during autumnal decline, not superstition. Intention. And let's not forget the alchemists themselves. Some were patronized by the same families that commissioned the artists. In fact, the distinction often blurred. Artists would attend lectures on transmutation. Alchemists sketched emblems for treatises. Both groups hunted the same thing, transformation, lead into gold, idea into image. In your own workshop, an assistant brings you a new pigment cochineal, imported through Spanish traders. He tells you it's made from insects crushed in the sun. You recoil, then you try it. The red is unlike any other deep velvet-like alive. You use it in the cloak of a martyr, and it turns the entire piece electric. Your patron asks what it is. You simply say, imported dye. You don't tell him it bled from beetles. And what about divine geometry? You learn to construct the sacred triangle, not just as a background motif, but as an invisible armature for your compositions. Christ said at the apex, disciples along the base. It pleases the eye. No one can explain why, but the harmony is real. Painters talk about channeling heaven. You used to scoff. Then you spent hours trying to replicate that balance without success. Some even believe the right painting, built with the correct shapes and blessed materials, could act as a kind of doorway, a bridge between the viewer and the divine. The church doesn't fully endorse this, but they don't forbid it either. You recall one piece, an Annunciation, painted by a reclusive master in the Old Toronto district. The background was plain. The angel unusually subdued. But the positioning, the tilt of the Virgin's hand, the negative space between her and the lily, it struck something deep. Viewers said it made them weep without knowing why. Some claimed it healed minor ailments. Was it power? Or just suggestion? It's hard to say, and so you find yourself adding more care. You clean your tools under moonlight. You light incense before sketching. You whisper the saint's name before painting his eyes. Not because you believe, but because you don't want to risk being wrong. In this city, the line between art and magic isn't just thin. It's painted in gold leaf. The deeper you go into the world of Renaissance artistry, the harder it becomes to tell where rational skill ends and mystical thinking begins. Every technique carries with it not just a method, but a belief. In Florence, the most admired painters were not just craftsmen. They were seen as part philosopher, part magician, and often part madman. Some of the more ambitious workshops even kept small libraries of alchemical texts. You remember leafing through one such book. Pages crinkled with use, the ink faint but legible. Diagrams of strange machines, planetary wheels, and odd Latin phrases littered the margins. The master who owned it believed that understanding the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile was essential not just for doctors, but for color theory. Red represented heat and blood. Green was moist and passive. Even the moods of a painting could be dictated by these elemental forces. In his studio, palettes weren't arranged by shade, but by temperament. Melancholy tones to the left, choleric ones to the right. He insisted that only a sanguine hue could capture divine joy, and that painting a sorrowful martyr in golden tones would confuse the spirit. You thought it was nonsense until you tried it, and you had to admit, the harmony felt different. Not everyone subscribed to the same ideas, of course. Some painters were strict rationalists. They saw geometry as a human invention, not a divine one. But even they kept certain habits, like never painting on feast days or waiting until St. Luke's Day to begin portraits. These weren't written rules. They were customs. quiet rituals carried in brushstroke and breath. You meet a young assistant who refuses to work on panels facing west. The setting sun curses the hand, he says. His mentor laughs, but still lets him switch easels. No one wants to tempt bad fortune. In the countryside outside Florence, you're introduced to a retired artist who now makes inks from roots and fungi. His little workshop smells like wine and vinegar and moss. He shows you a black ink made from oak galls and iron, so rich it reflects blue in the right light. But don't use it on saints, he warns. It's a sorrowful ink, for sinners only. You ask him how he knows? He simply replies, "It told me." You smile. But later, when you use it on a depiction of Judas, the results are haunting. The lines look burned into the page. You never use it again. Sometimes the materials themselves carry superstitions. Mica is used for celestial highlights, but must be drowned in silence, or else it scatters the stars. Malachite should be stored in darkness. Red lead, toxic and vivid, is thought to capture the heat of Mars. It's only used in paintings of war or divine fury. Gold leaf, that most glorious of materials, comes with its own rules. The act of gilding is nearly sacred. The glue, called bowl, must be spread evenly with a badger hair brush. Then the gold is laid down carefully, with breath held and pressed gently with a cushion. Some masters cross themselves before this step. Others burn incense. One even swore the gold adhered better if a prayer was whispered during the pressing, and maybe it did. His halos always seemed to shimmer more than anyone else's. Perspective itself, this crowning invention of the Renaissance, is treated with reverence. The vanishing point is considered not just a mathematical convenience, but a spiritual one. It shows the order of God, one friar tells you. It reminds us the world is not chaos. When you paint with true perspective, things align, faces calm, rooms feel right. A crooked line can ruin the spell. You learn to draft like a surveyor. At one point, you're hired to complete a chapel mural where the original artist died mid-project. His notes include not just sketches, but instructions like mix the ochre only on waxing moon, and begin the angel's robe when Venus is in Libra. You want to ignore them. But out of respect or maybe curiosity, you follow the timings. The result? Your hand moves easier. The composition settles faster. Coincidence, perhaps? But after that, you stop mocking the stars. You also start to notice how patrons feed this blending of science and mystery. A Medici cousin asks you to include 7 lily in a nativity scene, not 6, not 8. 7 opens the heavens, he says, then winks as if admitting he doesn't fully believe it himself. But he insists. Another client wants his portrait surrounded by zodiac symbols, not overtly. Just lightly inscribed on the chair, on the hem of his robe, on the buckles of his shoes. I was born under Leo, he says, and I want the lion with me always. Even the churches aren't immune. One priest commissions a panel of St. Michael, but wants the background done in lapis and gold to reflect divine light. He instructs you to sprinkle powdered pearl over the wings. You warn him it won't last. He doesn't care. It's the shimmer that matters, he says. You realize over time that belief in this world is layered. No one fully trusts the magic, but no one fully discards it either. It lives in the margin, in the spaces between brush and canvas, between day and dusk. You begin keeping your own small notebook, nothing dramatic, just observations, which paints dry fastest in certain weather. What dreams you have after using particular colors. The names of patrons who prefer Mercury hours to Saturn ones. You don't show it to anyone, but it grows slowly, quietly. Years later, an apprentice of yours asks why you mix your primer while facing east. You don't have an answer ready. You simply say, it feels right, and that's enough. Because in this city, in this time, art is never just craft. It's conversation. With the past, with the cosmos, with something deep beneath the surface. And maybe, just maybe, that's why so much of it still glows. Chapter 30, the invention that changed everything. You first hear about it in a whisper over a bowl of lentil soup at a crowded workshop meal. One of the younger apprentices leans over, eyes wide, and says, "They figured it out." The vanishing point, 1 point, all lines, like a miracle, you smirk. You heard wild claims before, some about talking statues, others about paint that could cure blindness. But this one, it doesn't fade. The phrase comes up again and again, always said with reverence. A room that stretches endlessly. A plaza that pulls you in. Paintings that feel like falling forward. And then you see it. It's just a fresco tucked inside a small church you almost didn't enter, Santa Maria Novella. But when you step before the wall, it's as if the stone breaks open. The architecture of the church continues into the painting. Columns recede. Vaulted ceilings stretch into the canvas. Shadows fall exactly where they should. You reach out instinctively to touch the illusion and feel only plaster. Your eyes have been tricked. But not with deceit, with precision. It was Bruno Leschi who demonstrated it first. Not a painter, but an architect. He built a small panel of a Florentine square, complete with buildings and sky. Then he drilled a hole in the back and asked viewers to look through it while facing a mirror. What they saw was uncanny. A painting indistinguishable from the real view. He'd cracked the code. He'd proven that space itself could be drawn. That changed everything. Painters once used intuition. Rooms curved awkwardly. Figures loomed strangely. There was beauty, but not logic. Now there was a system. A horizon line, orthogonals, a central vanishing point where all receding lines met. With this method, a flat panel could mimic a palace hall. A dome could seem to rise above the canvas. Even the heavens could be calculated. Workshops buzz with the discovery. Artists pore over treatises by Alberti, who writes of how to divide space, how to measure light. Rulers and compasses become as essential as brushes. You find yourself sketching cubes for days, studying how a tile floor diminishes into the distance. At first, it feels like math homework. Then it feels like magic. You start to experiment. A chapel commission asks for the Annunciation, and you decide to place the Virgin in a colonnade. You build the scene with lines, hundreds of them, guiding the shadows, the angles, the receding archways. When you finish and step back, the effect startles even you. The viewer doesn't just see the scene. They stand in it. But it isn't easy. One misplaced vanishing point ruins everything. A too sharp angle warps the illusion. One apprentice faints trying to paint a staircase in perspective. Convinced the lines are cursed, you comfort him, then quietly erase his work. And there's debate. Oh, there's always debate. Some masters say too much realism robs the spirit. That the divine should not obey geometry. That a painting of heaven shouldn't look like a banker's villa. But others argue the opposite, that the perfection of perspective mirrors God's order. That making a viewer feel present in a holy scene is the greatest devotion of all. Some artists push it further. They build entire altarpieces where the real architecture of the church blends into the painted one. A column on the wall aligns with a painted arch. A real window illuminates a painted floor. People gasp, and sometimes pray. You begin to notice new commissions lean more heavily into these illusions. A nobleman asks for his dining room ceiling to show the sky opening above him, clouds parting, angels leaning down. You spend weeks on scaffolding, head tilted back, neck aching. But when it's done, he weeps, not because it's perfect, but because it feels infinite. With this power comes a strange obsession. Some artists begin to lose themselves in the lines. They create impossible spaces, rooms that stretch beyond logic, tables that vanish into horizons. One painter, it said, locked himself in a tower to study how light changes with angle. When they found him weeks later, he'd drawn nothing but grids. And yet, this precision births new styles. Light behaves better in perspective. Figures feel grounded. Distance becomes narrative. A road into the background becomes a journey. A shadow on a wall becomes a metaphor. Suddenly, a simple scene, a child in the courtyard, can feel epic. You try to teach it to a new apprentice. He struggles. Says it's too rigid. Art shouldn't need rulers, he grumbles. But then, late one night, he brings you a sketch. A tavern interior, humble and warm. The barrels taper gently into space. The hearth casts a shadow along the corner. You say nothing, just nod. He beams. Still, not all is triumph. Some patrons resist. They find perspective unsettling. It draws you in too much, one says. I want holiness, not immersion. Others accuse it of sorcery. The paintings watch me, one merchant whispers. And some works fail. You recall a chapel wall where the lines were off by a fraction. The room looked warped. The figures stretched. The client refused to pay. The master drank for a week. But most of the time, it works. And it works wonders. You walk into a new chapel and see Christ seated at a table. And for a moment, you almost pull out a chair. The illusion is complete, not just of space, but of presence. You're there, inside the scene. Perspective did not just revolutionize art, it redefined how people saw their world, and how they saw themselves within it. As perspective tightened its grip on the Florentine imagination, the obsession deepened. What started as a discovery became a competition. Who could draw the most convincing illusion? Who could lead the viewer's eye the farthest into a painted world? Who could make the canvas vanish entirely? Workshops became laboratories of vision. Artists sketched grids upon grids, pinning wax strings to their panels, anchoring lines with thumbtacks, even constructing small viewing boxes to test how an image would bend through a fixed lens. You hear of a man in San Gimignano who builds a rotating wheel covered in paintings of archways, spinning it in candlelight to test how shadows stretch with motion. The results are dizzying, but brilliant. And with perspective came optics, another realm once thought the concern of philosophers and engineers. Now, painters devour books on the subject. They talk of cones of vision, of reflection and refraction, of the eye as an instrument. You remember a master who taught his apprentices to squint when examining a composition. Look through your lashes, he said. That's how God sees the light. At first, it sounded silly. Then you tried it. And the shadows softened. The balance clarified. Mirrors, once luxury items, become indispensable tools. You're taught to turn your back to a painting and view it through a hand mirror to test the reversal of space. You learn to flip drawings upside down to scan for inconsistencies. If the illusion holds even when inverted, your mentor tells you, you have something real. Some take it further, experimenting with camera obscura devices, dark boxes with pinholes that project inverted images onto a flat surface. It's rumored that Da Vinci himself used such tools in his notebooks. Though no one admits it openly, many have peeked through the lens and been astonished. The world becomes a ghost shimmering accurate and transient. But with all this new knowledge comes unease. For some, the precision of perspective strips away the mystery. It's too clean, one older painter grumbles. Too cold. He misses the golden backgrounds, the divine flatness of icons, the glow that once surrounded saints without the aid of artificial depth. Even younger artists begin to feel the pressure. You hear whispers that perfect lines can't replace imperfect feeling, that a soul lives more in a crooked Madonna than a mathematically flawless one, and yet commissions keep coming for the new style. Patrons want to be wowed. They want space. They want realism. Emotion is secondary. You take on a large-scale commission, a procession scene meant to stretch across an entire hall wall. It's your biggest project yet. You spend weeks just drafting the cityscape in the background, measuring each building's angle, each doorway's depth. You nearly go blind drawing the cobblestones receding into distance. When the client first sees it, he gasps. Not because of the figures, but because of the feeling that he could walk straight into the painting and down that street. He doesn't comment on the saint in the corner, only on the architecture. It's gratifying and a little hollow. To compensate, you start hiding details. A cat on a rooftop, a child peeking from behind a column, a reflection in a polished shoe. You tell no one. But when viewers find them, when they lean in, squinting, they smile. Not because of the illusion, but because they've discovered something human. Not all perspective experiments succeed, of course. There's the now infamous ceiling of a small chapel where an ambitious painter attempted to depict a dome above an already domed space. His math was solid, but the illusion failed. Viewers felt queasy. Some even claimed headaches. The painting was whitewashed within a year. His reputation never recovered. Still, the innovations don't stop. You visit a studio where a young artist is experimenting with colored glass. He paints a window frame with perfect perspective, then overlays it with tinted panels to catch real light. As the sun moves, the scene inside the frame changes subtly, as if the painting breathes. It's beautiful. It's impractical. He'll probably go broke, but you admire the attempt. You remember hearing someone say that perspective isn't just about seeing, it's about being seen. Paintings now direct your gaze, guide your position. The viewer becomes part of the composition. The artist, in a sense, controls your movement. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part. Not the trick of the eye, but the surrender of control. Even so, you can't resist it. You begin a portrait of your friend, and instead of the usual frontal pose, you place her slightly to the side with a long corridor trailing behind her, a table, a window, a slice of blue sky. When she sees the finished work, she laughs. "It feels like I'm sitting in my own memory," she says. That pleases you more than any technical praise. Because perspective, for all its geometry, becomes a tool for feeling, for placing people not just in space, but in story. As the century draws to a close, you look at older works with new eyes. The flat gold backdrops now seem distant. You crave shadow. Depth. You want to fall into the image, and so do others. Perspective didn't just change how people painted. It changed how they imagined their place in the world. No longer outside of it, but inside it entirely. Chapter 14. The Workshop's Final Silence. It always begins with the smell of wax. When a master passes, the wax is brought out not to seal a letter, but to close a life. First, the will is fetched from the chapel registry. Then the apprentices are summoned not for painting, but for cleaning, inventory, and grief disguised as labor. And in the quiet that follows, the workshop that once rang with hammering, brush scratching, and the low hum of murmured prayers begins to settle into an uneasy hush. It is the silence that makes everything real. You were still young when the first master you worked under died. He was strict, but fair. You remember how he used to balance a brush on his knuckle when thinking, how he whistled when mixing green, how his left shoe always creaked. He died in his sleep, so they said, but his sudden absence felt louder than any shout. When you arrived the next morning, the door remained shut longer than usual. Inside, the apprentices stood awkwardly, hands folded, eyes lowered. The pigment jars sat untouched. The cat slept on the master's stool, unaware. A notary came soon after. He read out the will in flat, tired tones, itemizing every tool and canvas. You expected some acknowledgement, your name, a brush, a token gesture. Instead, everything was left to a distant cousin in Pisa. You spent the next 3 weeks packing crates and watching your former mentor's life reduced to an inventory list. And when it was over, the workshop shuttered. You walked past it months later, hoping it might reopen. The shutters were warped, the sign above the door had faded, and weeds had begun growing along the wall. A dog was sleeping in the alley where you once dried fresco boards. That was when you realized a master's death is not just the end of a man. It's the end of a style, a rhythm, a school of thought, sometimes even a way of seeing the world. Other workshops tried to preserve what they could. You knew of a studio where the apprentices kept the master's seat untouched for a year. No one dared use his favorite maul stick or his personal palette. They spoke about him in the present tense, long after his funeral. But inevitably, one commission leads to another, and life returns slightly altered. A new artist takes the chair. The palette is reused. The colors mix again, but never quite the same. And then, of course, there were the opportunists. When a master dies, competitors circle like crows. Patrons are poached, techniques stolen, unfinished panels passed off as new commissions. You saw it once with your own eyes. A rival painter buying up a dead master's half-finished saints and repainting the faces to resemble his own style. The clients never noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. Art, after all, was business. Sometimes a workshop is inherited. A son, a nephew, a trusted apprentice takes over. These transitions are rarely smooth. The clients are wary. He isn't his father, they whisper. His color is colder. His angels have no soul. You knew one such heir who worked twice as hard and was paid half as much, always in his mentor's shadow. When he finally signed a panel with his own name, he placed it in the lower right corner, small and discreet. He never signed that big again. The city itself changes with each passing of a master. You begin to notice it in the piazza. The old painters who once argued over fig leaves and pigment purity disappear one by one. The benches are quieter. The taverns hold fewer debates. Some styles fade completely. Frescoed chapels begin to flake, and no one knows the formula to restore them. A signature technique dies with a hand that never taught it. But not all loss is visible. You remember a sculptor, a genius in marble, who never wrote down his ratios. His assistants tried to replicate his methods after his death, but the stone never sang the same. One apprentice swore he saw a ghost in the studio, a hand shaping air, fingers curled as if chiseling the wind. Whether real or imagined, the sculpture that followed cracked right through the center. They left it in the garden, hidden by ivy. The saddest part, you come to learn, isn't the silence. It's the forgetting. After enough time passes, people stop saying, Master Giovanni's workshop. They say, the old shop on Via del Moro, then that empty house with the crooked shutters. Finally, nothing. And yet the ghosts remain. A few still try to preserve the legacy. Some write treatises hoping to pass on what they know. Others teach obsessively, drilling their methods into students. But students forget, or rebel, or twist the old ways into something new. And so even the best instruction becomes rumor, then myth, then legend. You walk into a church one morning and see a painting it was your master's. You help prime the panel. You fetched the blue from the pigment dealer. You remember the joke he made about the saint's nose, but no plaque bears his name. The guidebook attributes it to someone else entirely. You don't correct it. You just sit quietly and remember. Because that's the real legacy. Not fame, not wealth, not even the art itself, but memory. The way a certain red feels warm because he once said it should. The way you tilt a face slightly left because that's how she taught you to see sorrow. The way a half-finished sketch reminds you of a voice, a cough, a humming tune. Even when the workshops go silent, the echo remains. As the Renaissance matured, so too did the city's attitude toward memory. Florence, once a hive of humming workshops and ceaseless commissions, began to reflect on what had been built and who had built it. But nostalgia, like everything else in this city, was selective. The grand masters, the names chiseled into arches and whispered by foreign. Dignitaries were granted immortality through marble tombs and dedicated altars. Their likenesses were painted into frescoes, seated beside saints and scholars. But hundreds of others, just as skilled in their niche, vanished with no marker. Their stories, their sketches, their innovations, all absorbed into the walls they helped decorate. You come to realize that a workshop's final silence isn't always a dramatic ending. Sometimes it fades the way a pigment dulls, slowly, subtly, until one day no one quite remembers how vivid it once was. After a certain age, you begin to hear news of death more regularly. The old friend from your apprentice days gone in the spring. The mosaist who once taught you about locusts lost to a winter fever. The cartographer whose workshop was a sanctuary for dreamers, his maps now lining a bookseller's stall, sold page by page. It becomes harder to know who still lives. Harder still to know who remembers you. But life doesn't pause for mourning. The city demands its portraits. The churches want their saints. You return to work, hands more careful now, brushstrokes steadier. Perhaps it's age. Or maybe it's the knowledge that each painting could be your last. You start signing your name more clearly, just a little larger. Nothing boastful, but legible. You've earned that. Sometimes you're called upon to finish a dead painter's work. It's a strange kind of intimacy, stepping into another's vision. Their underdrawings, their notes in the margins, the incomplete fold of a robe. You try to honor their rhythm, to breathe life into their design, without overtaking it. A delicate balance. And when it's finished, you never quite feel pride. More like relief, like placing a stone gently on a grave. The city, for all its change, still remembers in other ways. A certain angel's face reappears across 3 generations of painters soft, with a tilt of amusement. No one knows who first drew her. A palette of olive green and dusty gold becomes known as the Sarto shade, though the original Sarto is long buried. A curved staircase in a landscape keeps cropping up, slightly different each time. A visual whisper passed through studios like a secret handshake. But even legacies, you find, can be unsteady. One painter's entire collection is discovered decades later behind a butcher's shop, all stacked like firewood, forgotten. Another's treatise is burned by a new regime, deemed heretical for mentioning planetary motion. One morning, you pass a former workshop, now a bakery. The smell of fresh bread spills out where once the air was thick with turpentine. No one inside knows that above their heads is a faded fresco of the Magi, painted by a master who once dined with the Medici. And yet, there are quiet acts of preservation. A widow who refuses to sell her husband's final panel, even when offered a chest of gold. A student who copies every sketch of his teachers in a personal codex, never sharing it, just keeping it close. A librarian who tucks unsigned drawings into the backs of books, hoping they'll survive. You, too, start to gather things. Scraps, pigment recipes, letters, a broken palette. You store them in a small box beneath your work table, unsure what you're saving them for. A future generation? A curious apprentice? Or maybe just for yourself, as proof that you were here, that you mixed ochre, that you painted firelight, that once, for a brief time, you added color to a world already ablaze with genius. And then, one evening, you hear of another death. A great master, a name that once filled squares with awe. You walk past his workshop the next day. The shutters are closed, the door bolted, a black ribbon hangs from the handle. And yet, through the window, you see a single canvas still on the easel, unfinished. The brush beside it, stiff with dried paint. You don't go in. You simply nod and keep walking, because now you understand a workshop doesn't truly die when its master does. It dies when no one remembers how it sounded. When no one recalls the creak of the stool, the rhythm of the sanding, the smell of charcoal on damp wood, when its silence becomes just another silence. But until that moment, it lingers, in the curve of a brushstroke, in the echo of a lesson, in the hands of the student who paints by candlelight, trying to chase something he only half recalls, and in you, always in you. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.